give 15 minutes or so for that at the end, or less, depending on how lively you are.
Right. This is a challenge on this medium. I've noticed that people are more reluctant to ask questions on this medium than they are when we are in person. So yes, I'm glad you said that it could be less if people are not forthcoming.
Yes, because with the three of you as such expertise, I'm sure that we could have a wonderful conversation for the whole period.
Right. But, absolutely.
Very good.
So, what we might do, Merit, I'll introduce you and then you can take it from there. Sure. Everybody does have access to bios, which we have posted, and we have given the links yesterday. Yes. So they should have it. So you don't really have to do necessarily a long introduction.
I'll do brief.
Then you take it over. After we finish, I think Deepak is going to say a few words. I don't see Deepak yet, but he will join. We'll allow another couple of minutes. We have been yesterday, certainly we started on time, and we'll do the same. About 9:02 we can begin.
Very good. And it's nice to see so many distinguished academic and other colleagues joining us this morning. I see Pravin. Morning.
Good morning.
Uday was with us yesterday, Arvind, I have to share with you. And we had promised him that Uday Kotak was actually speaking with us yesterday. And then our deal with him was that we will finish at 6:45 so he can be back at his residence at 7:30 to give the talk here.
Right, of course, yes. Yeah, so he connected from his residence, that's right. Correct. Hi, Deepak.
Good morning. How are you? Good morning, Merit. How are you?
Hello. So good to see you.
Very nice.
Hi, Naushad. He's still connecting to audio. Okay, I think we will begin. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are. It is my great pleasure to start day 2 of Columbia Summit on Indian economy. We had a great first day yesterday, and today we have an absolutely stellar panel, and it is being moderated by our longtime dean till the last semester, Mary Jano. She is a professor of practice both in CIP and the School of Law at Columbia University. She currently also chairs the board of MasterCard, following Ajay Banga. And she also served as a member of the appellate body of the World Trade Organization and many other things. She has had a very long and very distinguished career. The bios are all posted, so please do download if you would like to know more. And with that, we will begin today. Merit, over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Arvind. Let me first say that having only recently stepped down from being dean, I do feel a personal pride in what has been accomplished by our Raj Center under your leadership, Arvind. We're very proud of it at Columbia University. It's a major center of learning and engagement on the Indian economy, and really delighted that we were able to do this important conference. yesterday, today, and the next day. So welcome this morning, this evening. I see many friends here. And I'm very pleased to have the three speakers and experts this morning. You have their bios, so I'll be brief, but I do want to highlight just a few points about them. Anjali Bansal is the founder, as you know, of Avana Capital. It's been really involved in the innovation startup environment with many successes, but she also comes to it with policy experience with Niti Aayog and as a corporate director earlier in private equity. I think you were soon to be president of the Chamber of Commerce, and so an extraordinary innovation background. And Noshir Kaka is the senior partner at McKinsey. You co-lead the technology, media, and telecommunications practice. I know you have helped global companies design their digital strategies and analytics strategies, and you've worked with governments and also been involved in creating global educational initiatives, a world-class business school in India. And Sharad Sanghi, CEO and Managing Director of NetMagic. Very nice to see you again. Both Anjali and Sharad are part of the Columbia family. Very, very proud of that. You have been a pioneer in cloud computing in India, and I know you built India's leading managed hosting service provider and have a deep technology background. So we are very, very fortunate to have these leaders with us. I think our goal is to cover a range of topics, both the general environment in India, digital India, software, and then open it up for some comments or questions from those watching. So please feel free to send your questions in as they occur to you, but we'll turn to them at the end. So we don't have a paper in this case, so we're going to have a dialogue and move through a variety of topics. Let me suggest, if you're not speaking, that you put yourself on mute so we reduce the background noise of the attendees. So the first question, maybe scene setting, would really be to invite our speakers to comment on the general environment for entrepreneurship and digital innovation in India. You know, one associates India with a lot of it. But you look around the world and you say, the inhibitors often are capital as a bottleneck. Is the right kind of capital accessible to the startup environment? How's the ecosystem operating? And 2021 actually, the data says showed a fourfold increase in VC funding. Up to some $33 billion. And a lot of deals were announced in 2021. But I guess I'm asking you to both speak to the environment and also share how you think it's been affected by COVID. Because this has accelerated digital activity in many parts of the world. But how's it affected India's ecosystem development? Let me invite Anjali to get us started.
Good morning, everyone. Namaste. And I'm so delighted to be here. Thank you, Merit and Arvind, for inviting me with my friends, Noshir and Sharad, who, as it turns out, are actually very good friends for a long time. So, Merit, you asked, it's a big sort of packed question, so let me unpack it a little bit. I think over the course of the last couple of years during COVID, the Indian digitization accelerated across multiple sectors and segments, particularly some of the earlier, slower to adopt digitization segments like MSMEs and sectors like healthcare and education. And so all of that actually accelerated fairly significantly. And commensurately, entrepreneurial activity also accelerated. So it is absolutely remarkable what we have seen in terms of new startup formation, just some phenomenal talent choosing to become entrepreneurs, coming out of the second wave of startups, if you will. So people coming out of successful scale startups and saying, I'm going to be an entrepreneur myself versus continue to work. Young folks coming out of engineering colleges, management schools are choosing to not take jobs at all. So this is, I think, the first generation we are seeing of young folks going straight into entrepreneurship. So I think we have seen just an absolutely phenomenal time during the last 2 years. I think we are looking at a golden decade ahead for Indian entrepreneurship. So looking forward, I think three factors coming together. I talked about the talent. So absolutely, the quality of talent we are seeing now as startup entrepreneurs, I think unprecedented. The second piece is availability of capital for a variety of reasons, partly because we are seeing value creation through successful exits over the last couple of years, as well as just geopolitical forces. We are seeing a lot of capital inflow into India. We are also starting to see participation of domestic capital in the startup ecosystem. Today, about 80% of the capital that goes into Indian startups is actually foreign capital through funds. The policy regime is very supportive of startups. That's kind of the third force in our forces at work model. The policy particularly supportive of creating more startups, creating the right sort of tax structures, capital structures. We have seen the creation of the Alternative Investment Fund, the AIF regime. So there is third piece is policy support. And I think finally is there's a whole ecosystem, the virtuous cycle that has got created. So it's a particularly interesting time. We are seeing the creation, and I'll come back to this later in the conversation also, of new digital rails being created. So India, of course, innovated with Aadhaar, which has given the dignity of identity to 1.3 billion Indians, unique biometric ID. We built on that UPI and India Stack, which is ubiquitous payments. And now we are seeing the emergence of the open network for digital commerce. So it's kind of the UPI movement, if you will, for commerce. So the creation of this large-scale digital infrastructure makes it easier for new models to emerge that don't have to build the highways. The rails and the highways are being created in the public domain. So I'll pause there.
Thank you so much. That was a fantastic introduction. Nosher, could you comment as well? Is this your vision of what you see happening? And could you elaborate, please?
Sure. Firstly, thank you, Merit and Arvind. It's so nice to be here, and it's a fantastic panel and audience. And as Anjali said, Sharad, Anjali, and I go back many years, so hopefully we won't agree on everything, but we'll have a lively debate. This one, I will absolutely agree with both Anjali and you. I think it's a fantastic time to be an entrepreneur in India. Anjali spoke about many of the opportunities that have actually sprung to, and I think capital, indeed, from my little experience, is not actually a blocker anymore. In fact, we've got way too much capital chasing too few good entrepreneurs. I think you've also seen the maturing of the industry. You've seen it move from what was largely Me Too ideas in the initial phase of, focused on consumer tech and so on. Of course, pioneers like Sharad, barring that, I mean, we saw a lot of, consumer tech money going in. We're seeing now a lot of B2B SaaS companies getting funded. In fact, some of the biggest success stories and arguably, the most sustainable success stories across the world will come from B2B SaaS. We're seeing newer investments coming into deep tech, which is really encouraging. Not too many of them, but we're seeing some of them coming through in deep tech. So I think this entire ecosystem that Anjali talked about, supported by 4 or 5 things, right? One is the availability of capital. The second is a sandbox environment. And we talked about 3 or 4 of the largest data platforms in the world today are actually in India. Aadhaar being one of them, Auckland coming through, GSTN network. We've got a whole host of them coming through. And that actually that's spurring a lot of innovation and entrepreneurship. Third, as you mentioned on the start, right? COVID has been an incredible, it's been really unfortunate for many parts of our healthcare system and lives lost, but it actually has massively spurred digitization. It has spurred, for example, in healthcare, you now have multiple platforms that do remote diagnostics, just as it's taken for granted. And 2 years ago, that was not even thought of as an option for many of the senior specialists in the country. There are 2 areas I see that are holding us back still, if I could elaborate that on as well. I don't see that much investment going in genuine R&D. And that's where, real R&D dollars, whether fundamental or development, I think that's something we need to actually work on. And I think second is what the schools in the US have done extraordinarily well is the academia and startup ecosystem, which has got a whole lot better over the years with, many sort of, committees, forums, and all like this. But I think that research to commercialization pipeline, if you take it, could actually be a lot faster, and it could be fourfold higher than that. But there's no denying the fact it's a great time to be an entrepreneur. And for professional services firms like I'm in currently, Anjali used to be with Spencer Stewart, we're having our hands full to keep our talent excited and engaged.
Thank you very much. Those are very helpful and interesting comments. And let me just add the thought that, all of us in academia, I think, are asking ourselves as well, how do we support that ecosystem from the universities, taking innovation out and focusing on it a lot. We're doing that at Columbia, and it's taking a lot of new forms. We could talk about what those forms are. Sharad, I'm really interested what you have to say in this. You've been very much a pioneer, and how are you evaluating the environment today?
So first of all, thank you for inviting me. And, I agree with both Naushad and Anjali. It is a fabulous time to be an entrepreneur. And obviously COVID, as we all know, has accelerated. Digital transformation that we've been talking about for years really got accelerated during COVID. I wanted to touch upon what Naushad alluded to as the maturing of the startup ecosystem and being entrepreneurs. Initially, it was more, taking an Amazon became a Flipkart in India, or Uber became an Ola in India. So that even my company was very similar to Exodus in the US, and we started NetMagic, which is a data center company in India. But now we're seeing entrepreneurs with unique ideas. We're seeing a lot of deep tech startups that are mushrooming across the country. Agree with Naushad again that I think like in the US, there's a lot of government involvement. So a lot of the innovations of Silicon Valley, I read an article which said that I think 6 or 7 of the key technologies in Apple are actually funded by the government. I think that's one area where India, it's not that the government is not trying, but I don't think that has succeeded yet in the country. So I think the government relationship with, whether it's startups or venture capital firms, or figuring out how to do deep tech, which typical VC or typical private equity firm may not have the patience to fund technologies that go, that would require maybe a gestation period of 10 years or something before they take. And so in the US, some of this was done by the government, right? Whether it was DARPA or NASA or whatever, right? In India, that is lacking. So I think that's one area that we need to address. But overall, I think from a pure entrepreneurship perspective, there's access to capital. There's, there is, as Anjali mentioned, there's the entire digital India stack that is available. Infrastructure has improved tremendously. Whether it's data center infrastructure, cloud computing infrastructure, connectivity infrastructure, the entire digital highway in India is now much, much better than maybe 5 or 10 years back. I think one area where India still lacks, and I think this is something that we need to address, and maybe it's an opportunity for more entrepreneurship, is cybersecurity. I think India, and forget about that, and one is on the regulations we are behind, but more importantly on awareness of cybersecurity, I think there is a lot to be desired. So so that's what I would like to add here.
Thank you. Just for the sake of our audience, maybe not everyone is, maybe everyone is, but could you say could you and Naushad both say, when you use the term deep tech startups, what are you encompassing from that?
So, Naushad, you want to go?
Sharad, please.
So where fundamental, where there is some fundamental IP, there's some intellectual property, and there is some, something that is being created. When I refer to deep tech, I'm trying to talk about something that is being a unique idea that's created using fundamental innovation. It's not just something that you take that has already succeeded elsewhere and you just copy that idea here. And so you could use maybe using artificial intelligence or something that basically creates something unique. That's what I mean by deep tech. Yes.
Okay. Thank you. Yep. Thank you very much. And
I don't know, you may want to add something to that. Yeah.
No, that's exactly right. Right. I think many definitions in deep tech, but I think it's a combination of really, if you think about, for example, just to give you an example, cyber physical systems, Merit, right? I mean, the way humans will interact with physical and virtual systems going forward is just another leap, right? And I think some of that development of fundamental research can actually be done much more in this country, because we have access to more data, we have access to good talent pools, and that's an area that we actually should go forward, right, with. Mm-hmm. So that's just an example.
Thank you. I'd like to ask you, Noshir, to comment a bit more on this concept, which I like very much. I think it's very important, and of the sandbox environment. Sometimes when you create sandboxes, you ring fence them, right? And the question is, are you ring fencing them only for local players? Are you ring fencing them by sector? Tell us what this means to you about India's receptivity and experimentation in the sandbox concept.
Yeah. So I think if you start with, India does not have an abundance of capital or resources historically, right? Natural resources. But one of the things we actually have in abundance is actually data. And you start with actually the intelligent, thoughtful, compliant use of data. And you take that environment, you take that ability, and you say, can you apply it, Merit, to some of the biggest problems of the country, right? So let's give you an example, right? In our work, we think the use of data in agriculture will be one of the top 2 opportunities of data in this country entirely. Now, if you looked at the US or any other developed nation, it would be telecom, it would be banking, it would be retail, it would be consumer, it would not be agriculture. But if you want to double the farmers' incomes, right, the use of data, weather, right, farm data, to actually have that available at a granular form in this country, with today's technology, not even going to anyone's future technology, with today's technology, you could almost double to quadruple the yields. Right? Now, if we had the government and others thinking just like we built Aadhaar, thinking about farm data, thinking about the next generation of weather data, right? To thinking about the soil health card and how you actually make that available, right, on a platform, you could pretty much unleash an entire generation of agricultural startups focused on agriculture, right? That would double or triple the productivity. That's just one area. We could look at 7 or 8 other areas where a sandbox-like environment, where in a thoughtful way, you allow access to data, you make it publicly available, you control it, then control the uses of it, but you'll have a dramatic improvement on the lives and livelihoods of India.
Thank you very much. I'd like to come back later to the subject of data itself, but let's lay down the environment a little bit more. And, at the outset, Anjali, you made some really, really interesting comments about, the policy environment as being supportive of entrepreneurship. And I wonder if you could say a bit more about that. And what I'm in the back of my mind, of course, the dramatic steps that India took in creating a national ID system and utilizing it in support of financial inclusion. And I think of that as pretty, foundational for the broader ecosystem. But I know also that the Prime Minister often talks in terms of easing, living conditions through provision of services and really thinking about private-public partnerships as another priority. So could you say more about what you see the policy environment, Digital India, doing to support these developments?
Sure, Merit. I want to pick up from where Noshir and Sharad also left off and slightly disagree around the notion of we don't have enough happening perhaps on deep tech. And so to me, yes, there is not perhaps as much happening on deep tech today as has happened in the last 10 years on consumer internet, for example. And what we have seen in the last 5 years in terms of enterprise SaaS and models developing there. See, we can think about innovation of as product innovation or process innovation. And India, rather than sort of wait for government to come up with innovation per se, that is not the job of government, right? So it's the job of the entrepreneurial ecosystem and people like us. So I would say wait, and I will share a few examples where I actually think there is so much going on, both in terms of agri-tech particularly, as well as when we look at the application of data to solving large-scale problems. So this brings me back, Merit, to your question on policy. Three things. One is, as a government, overall, the level of engagement and consultative engagement with the startup ecosystem, both investors and entrepreneurs, is absolutely phenomenal. There is a continuous consultative dialogue that goes back and forth. There are open doors, whether it's the Ministry of Commerce, DPI, NITI Aayog, or even PMO. And there is a recognition that it is a partnership. And that partnership has got somewhat deepened, I would say, during COVID, when the ecosystem again came together with government and startups. We created something called ACT. So, and we saw a lot of these collaborative models emerge. So there is a consultative dialogue back and forth. We have seen that manifest in sort of responsive regimes on tax and so on. Much work to be done, but it's a start. The second is the building of, and I think this is a very, very uniquely Indian innovation, of building public rails for data and digitization. Nausha mentioned the sandbox. So yes, sandboxes are there. Actually, there are multiple sandboxes. There is a fintech sandbox. There is now the government has just announced in the latest budget the blended finance model, thematic funds, particularly for agri, for climate, drones, as well as what they're calling deep tech. Space tech is an emerging theme. So the government is putting in 20% as a sort of first, if you will, a seed capital, and encouraging new fund of funds to develop so that they can invest for patient capital in these spaces. There is the Prime Minister's Startup India Seed Fund that is actually investing in not startups, but incubators to specifically, again, support startups in these long gestation type, science type areas, which will not commercialize quickly and will not create venture type returns immediately. So, right. So these are spaces, whether it is tier 3, tier 4 India, or it is deep rural, agri, climate, drones, and so on, that don't attract mainstream capital today because those business models haven't scaled and need somewhat catalytic capital. So I think there's a fair amount of policy support, including now financial support in the new budget. And then I go back to our rails that have been built. I think Aadhaar has created a system of identity that makes it so much easier to establish, say, KYC, know your customer. The digital Aadhaar-based KYC is now the norm. That Aadhaar plus India Stack on payments has led to now the next level of disruption innovation through the Open Credit Network, the OCN, the account aggregator framework, the new umbrella entity. So lots of innovation occurring to disrupt what was earlier disruptive. And 3 new initiatives announced recently. One is Desh, which is linking the labor registry. So about 230 million workers who are on Ishram get connected to the MSME ministries of them. They get connected to the National Skill Development Council, as well as the National Career Services Portal, right? So the complete arc from skilling to continuous skilling to registration to jobs. So that whole arc becomes complete. And finally, the open network for digital commerce, which is taking a UPI type approach, a public-private partnership approach to commerce and enabling anyone to trade with anyone. Much like UPI made it possible for anyone, any of us to remit money to each other, and we kind of leapfrog the whole debit card, credit card space and went directly to digital payments. Same thing is happening in commerce today.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Thank you.
I'd love to come back and talk more and give some examples around what's happening in agri-tech and space tech that we see.
Okay, well, let's come back to that. Let me invite Sharad. You and I have had some very interesting conversations about the evolution of the policy environment around the world. Let me first invite you to offer any thoughts in general, and then I might ask some more specific ones, please.
I agree with Anjali, to the extent that I think the India Stack framework of the Aadhaar as well as the UPI, eKYC, and also the DigiLocker, and the entire India Stack framework, right, which enables identity, payments, and digital empowerment, has been phenomenal and is truly disruptive, right? So there's absolutely no doubt. I think what I was referring to earlier was, you see the kind of results. In some cases, to me, and I'm slightly differing with Anjali here, it appears that the government is kind of checkboxing everything. They're kind of complying with everything. They're giving a little bit here, a little bit there, but I don't see anything fundamental come out from the government. Like, for example, on the if you look at your iPhone, your touch screen, your maps, I think there's 7 key technologies in the iPhone that are actually funded by the US government. So that's what I meant when I said that, look, we need a lot more in that space. So I'm not saying the government is not doing anything, but it needs to do that. I think the fact that even the global majors like Amazon, Google, and Facebook and others are using UPI, right? That is testimony to the fact that India Stack is working, right? It's basically, it's amazing the number of, we have 1.3 billion, almost 80% of Indians now have bank accounts. So the financial inclusion impact is visible. From 17% 10 years back, it is now close to 80%. And the impact of even the payments, the kind of, I think over some $40-50 billion worth of payments have been directly remitted to people. I mean, it's just outstanding what has happened from the India Stack framework. I don't see, I think from a public-private partnership, to the extent that people will use the India Stack, absolutely happening. But I'm not sure that how successful, and I would love to hear other panelists' comments on this, co-innovating with the government, right? Doing public-private partnership and co-innovation. I'm not sure to what extent that is successful.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you very much. Let me ask Noshir a slightly more pointed question about this, if I may. What you hear around the world actually is also a certain rethinking by governments about trying to foster domestic innovation environments and exclude foreign participants or narrow the range of their activities. We've seen that in the United States, and there's actually a lot of talk about it. Less has actually been turned into law, but some has in concerns about foreign investment, for example, in cyber, in AI, and so forth. And so, and while I think we do have in the U.S. this great tradition of DARPA and so on to really put long-term risk capital into very hard questions, that where you think private capital won't go, that would have that long-term breakthrough potential. That's continuing, but there are many who feel it needs to really step up in the budget, and that pressure to do that, and I think interest in doing that is going up. And then, of course, you're seeing things that look more like industrial policy these days on semiconductors and other areas, sort of lessons from the supply constraints and fragility coming out of COVID. So I guess I am inviting Noshir to say a bit more about the policy environment as it affects foreign market participants in the innovation environment in India. If you have comments around that, I welcome that.
So Merit, I think you're absolutely on to a topic which is quite concerning for many of us these days, which is geopolitics all around us. Anjali started with that. I think Sharad also picked up on it in the cyber comments. Look, I think there's no doubt. I mean, we are heading into an environment that is unknown to many of us because we lived most of our lives in a liberating world, at least from a geopolitics perspective. And we are moving in, at least my personal prediction is we are moving into a more constraining world where, people will pick sides, people will pick technology types, people will pick certain stacks and not others. So I think it is unfortunate, but I think we're going to head in that direction. I think if you step back and you say, okay, let us look at what does that mean in terms of entrepreneurship and opportunities as a result of that environment, which we don't have much control over, you see 4 massive opportunities opening up. So first, you see, as you rightly pointed out, semiconductors. I think you will see more jobs getting created in semiconductors and high-tech manufacturing in India than probably any of us have seen, certainly through all of our working lives, and certainly through what we've seen historically as a 17% of India's GDP is in manufacturing, right? And that's going to be incredible because the multiplier effect of those jobs can never hit the scale. I mean, the IT services industry, with all due credit to what it's done over the years, affects 4 million people directly, right? Now we're talking about way in excess of that. So the first thing is it's gonna enable jobs and opportunities, at least from an Indian point of view, and therefore from an international point of view as well. Because you look at who's making those investments coming into India, it's all the multinational companies around the world. So that's one very big opportunity. The second is, I think there is a huge and continuing opportunity around SMB and medium enterprises around the world enabled by SaaS. I personally believe, and we put it out in a report last year with an entity called SaaS Boomi, that the SaaS opportunity in India and value creation will rival the IT services opportunity over the last 30 years. What the IT services industry did in 30, SaaS will do in the next 10. And that means create $1 trillion of value. And that is today, as Anjali said, I think it's even more than 80%. It's probably 90% or 100%, nearly 95% in the SaaS world, actually foreign capital. And essentially, whether it's domestic, housed in India or Silicon Valley, but has an India center and all of that, all of those opportunities are massive. And we can come back and talk a little bit about where we see those opportunities, but that is a third piece. I'll pick up on what Sharad said is cyber. I think we're going to see massive investments in cyber. And our current capabilities are fairly rudimentary. And most wars, unfortunately, in the future are not going to be fought only on the battlefield. And we have to get prepared for an environment that's very different. Most of us think of defense spending, we immediately go to some heavy armaments, but actually defense spending is going to be software as much as it's hardware in the future. And that, unfortunately, whether you like it or not, is an opportunity facing us. And the last one I will just say is a huge opportunity to just better Indians and the opportunity to socially lift an entire category. And I'll just pick on one thing that Anjali said, Desh. Not many people realize that this platform is if you don't have today in India, if you're a blue collar worker, you have no way of proving that I have a skill, except for somebody taking me at my word or seeing what I can do. Desh will transform that. And that is a huge opportunity to lift the lives of 400 million Indians. And by the way, that can be taken to countries around the world. And investments in that will be unique to India and countries like India that has this opportunity. So I'm very sad at the geopolitics, but I'm also excited because it'll force entrepreneurs to look at opportunities like this that is so relevant for the rest of the world that is not as developed as we would have liked it to be.
Thank you very much. Well, I think there are two themes here, and I invite Anjali to take up either one of these that's emerging. One is just about where we're seeing the innovations happening, and I think you have some examples you're going to share with us. But also, I think I've already seen a question, but it was in my own mind as well, to tell us a little bit more about this Dash platform and how it can work. Let me invite Anjali to share, because I know she's got some examples of dynamism to share. But also, if policy is relevant to that or not relevant, that would be welcome.
Sure. So I think we saw the first cycle of maybe the second cycle of entrepreneurships and startups in India. Sharad and folks like him really embodied the first cycle. People who came back from the US and made some very, very fundamental contributions to how Indian digitization emerged. Then we went through the second cycle of consumer internet. And models that were largely imported. Not that there is anything wrong with imported models at all. In fact, perfectly fine. So the Olas and the Oyos, etc., got created. What we are seeing today is really the Bharat innovation. So brand new models that are India ready and for India. And they're addressing not the urban affluent Indian, but really the tier 2, tier 3, tier 4 Bharat. There is a development, and again, this policy comes in here. There's a significant project underway on Indic languages. It's not vernacular. So it's not English versus vernacular. It's actually Indic languages, which is being supported by government, again in a PPP model. There is Desh, and we can come back and talk more about Desh. Consequently, what we are starting to see now as an early stage investor is just a phenomenally exciting new entrepreneurs emerging. There's recently a company called Pixel, which is actually doing satellite development, came out of India, young team, and they just took on this big, hairy, audacious goal of outside of ISRO creating satellites. So that's one. We invest actively in the agri-tech space. And for a long time, it was considered uninvestable. Today, because in some ways, tech cost curves have declined to an extent where you can actually put sensors into a small farm holding. And we are seeing companies like Fasal emerge that are doing data collection. Yes, we have a company called Farmart, which is actually absolutely revolutionizing the Indian rural retail, agri, mandi, that whole space. 2 million farmers onboarded without burning massive amounts of cash in literally just 1 year. Company called Iki, which has a patented technology for growing chambers and growing medium so that they can hydroponically solve India's food problem. So Bharat ki sabzi, not premium leafy greens, but Bharat ki sabzi. It's your tomato, onion, karela, bengan, and all the Indians on this, and Merit, you too will probably recognize these names. They are growing tomatoes at 8 rupees a kilo in Kota, in Rajasthan. So I think we are seeing so much exciting, true product innovation and process innovation coming out of this generation of entrepreneurs who are solving for Bharat problems. Whether it is in food security, we are seeing something similar emerge in climate and sustainability, where the entire arc, again, from R&D and science, still very nascent. We are not seeing that much happen in R&D, but certainly commercialization of models, large-scale digitization of supply chains. The use of AI. So today, AI, ML engineers are the hardest to recruit and hardest to retain for any company. Large enterprises have no hope of getting the best engineers because they're all going to startups, and startups keep seeing 30-40% attrition. So that's the level of embeddedness of using big data, AI, ML in actually everything. The digitalization of large enterprises and startups is now more or less ubiquitous. All boardrooms are now starting to get familiar with AI, ML. I don't think it was ever a boardroom topic, maybe even 5 years ago in all my years of board service. Cyber is front and center on the agenda, and sustainability is front and center on the agenda. Solving problems for Bharat in the Bharat way.
Thank you. I think AI, cyber, sustainability are the subject of boardrooms everywhere, as well as geopolitical risk, and so the absolutely topical. Sharad, do you agree with these comments, or do you have a different sense of where you've mentioned quite a few important areas where innovation is occurring, but I just want to make sure you have a chance to weigh in here on further on the role of policy and where the entrepreneurship is occurring and where India is succeeding. And I just, we've talked about moving beyond software. into SaaS. Anjali, you talked about agriculture. But, when I think about major platforms, we think of, China has this Weibo platform, Baidu, and so on. India, I think, has had less of a comparison of major platforms. So let me invite Sharad to speak further about where India is succeeding.
Yeah, so I wouldn't think it's a fair comparison to compare us with China. I think, as Anjali mentioned, right, and if you look at what Naushir also said, I totally agree that when you look at pulling that 400 millions out of Indians out of poverty and innovating for India, I think that is something unique that India is doing well, and we are seeing as Anjali calls it, the third generation of entrepreneurs doing that successfully. I think where we could do better, as I said, in fundamental research. And I think this is nothing to do with China. I think it's more to do with the fact that, well, I'm not sure how, I don't want to be controversial here, but a lot of Chinese technology is alleged to have been reverse engineered, right? So I'm not going to call that necessarily innovation, fundamental innovation. But I think we can do a lot more on fundamental research. Again, I'm not talking about process innovation. I know that Indians have figured out frugal innovation where with very little they can do a lot more, right? And that's because of the constraints that we face. So it's like necessity is the mother of invention. So we are able to do a lot more. But I think this creating something fundamental, like we've not seen something like a YouTube or something like a Google search or whatever, any of the fundamental technologies come out of India yet, right? And I think that's while we've done a great job. I agree with Anjali's feedback on what we've done for the country, right? I think it's trying to figure out what are the problems pertaining to India and solving those in a sustainable, scalable way. I think that's definitely happening, but it's not something that we aren't doing global innovation from India. Right, so I don't see enough. I don't think there are too many examples of something that we can say came out of India and is now across the world. There will be a few. I think Bajaj Auto talks about the fact that they've done innovation in India. Now their automobiles or the two-wheelers, etc., or three-wheelers are across in many countries across the world. And also, there are other companies, I'm sure, that have done something, but I don't think we've done enough when it comes to taking, the same Indian talent pool becomes the head of Google, becomes the head of Microsoft, becomes the head of all the top companies in the world. But why can't we get something like that done in the country itself so that we can say, okay, this is a product that somebody across the world uses, right? And I think that's where I think we need to do more.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very, very much. I'd like to stay with you for a moment, and because you've been such a leader in cloud and information, to just start our shifting our conversation a little bit more into this data question. I mean, I think I think all over the world, there's a very serious conversation occurring within countries around data governance, trying to strike the right balance, depending on the preferences of complex interests on security and privacy. And innovation. All of those factors are implicated by the world around data governance. And we are seeing trends towards data localization. And I think we're also seeing, strong voices from the innovation environment saying, what's crucial to foster the innovation environment is a degree of interoperability, at least between systems, if countries choose to make, but of course, a traditional U.S. view has been, an open regime is the best for innovation. So I wonder if, Sharad, you've thought deeply about this. If you could give your assessment of perhaps where we are in this discussion in India?
So I'd love to comment on that. So there was, I think we started this entire data protection, or it started with the personal data protection for ensuring data privacy, I think in the year 2017, and it's 5 years since. We still haven't yet finalized the bill. I think most recently it went from just personal data to including non-personal data as well, because I think the government couldn't figure out, when you're moving massive amounts of data, what is personal, what is not personal, became difficult to kind of judge. And so they said, let's include non-personal data as well. And obviously that created a lot of issues for corporates. And so so I think India is, as you rightly said, it's a very fine balance. On one hand, you want to promote data privacy. On the other hand, you have to make it, you shouldn't lose your competitive edge. You should be able to foster innovation. And if you do things that constrain any of that, then that is actually detrimental to the country's interests. And there have been many issues with the current version of the Data Protection Act, right? One is, as I said, is the inclusion of non-personal data. There are issues on restrictions of data transfer in different parts of the world. When you want to do transfer of data across borders, there are some restrictions in the current bill which make it difficult, as you said, to interoperate. A lot of people are not happy. I know it helps my business, but trust me, I'm not the one who wanted it. It's data localization is something that increases costs for people, especially startups, when they want to address global markets. Now they need to place equipment in the country, and that's not trivial. That's not straightforward. There are issues with respect to mandatory hardware and software certifications that have come up. That India has also talked about building its own version of the SWIFT payment transfer system. That will again cause an issue with interoperability. And then, of course, there is this issue that you lay all these conditions and then you exempt state actors or state agencies from any of this, which has again caused a lot of issues. Having said that, I think it's as you rightly said, Merit, it's a fine balance. I mean, there needs to be some legislation for ensuring privacy. But I think we're still a way off, right? Because the new draft that came out, right, has had severe objections. In the earlier drafts, there were some draconian provisions. I think those have been eased, but some new features have been introduced, which have again met with a lot of resistance. So it's going to take some more time before we get our hands around this. But I think my worry is that it will cause, whatever we do should not cause us to lose. As Anjali and Naushad mentioned, we've got a fantastic entrepreneurship environment right now. Economy is looking good. We're looking at fabulous growth rates again. The last thing we want to do is introduce some piece of legislation that actually sets us back. So I'm just hoping that doesn't happen. I know data privacy is important. I'm personally not in favor of data localization. I think data can reside wherever it's required, but I know that many countries have actually insisted on data localization because then the government has control. If they want to shut down a particular website or if they want to shut down some content, they can do it if it's within their country. But it's just one of those things you have to be very careful, because you could end up kicking yourself in the foot, right? You could really end up if it's not broken, don't fix it, right? So that's my worry.
Thank you very much. Let me just comment that we are seeing some policy frameworks develop on a regional basis, like what used to be called the TPP and now the CPTPP in Asia, with Japan and ASEAN countries that have rules around these issues of sort of the first step of, I think, fairly elaborated rules, but much more could be developed that are not in favor of data localization, that prohibit data localization. So, there are different choices being made around the world on this question. But let me invite Naushad and Anjali to talk about, because you've both touched on, data as the driver of innovation. And so I'm inviting you both to comment on the governance and encouragement, in effect, around the use of that data, if either of you would like to speak further. And in the meantime, let me also signal again to our participants to start sending questions in the Q&A, or see if there are any after this next round. Noshir.
Thank you. Anjali, would you like to go first? All right. Okay. So Merit, I think logically, emotionally, spiritually, I completely agree with you and Sharad in the sense that anytime we put an impediment, whether it's nationalization, data localization, any form of restriction, it will slow down innovation. That's just, that's a fact of life. Sadly, I think, as I said earlier, I think we're heading into a world where none of us have, our previous patterns of judgment or experience are not likely to work, because it's going to be against forces that we don't understand fully, and we can't comprehend how they will actually play out. So I think, unfortunately, we have to prepare for a world where somebody coined this term to me the other day, which is called digital nationalization. And it's not just data, right? Because why is this happening? Because to Anjali's earlier point, we're seeing that AI is actually a foundational technology, right? It is not something that any country can be left behind on. We're seeing semiconductors is not just a resource. It is actually the resource that goes into everything that is being made today. Right. And so when you look at the building blocks of digital, whether it's physical, cyber, data, systems, compute, most countries are going to wake up and say, wow, we can't be left behind. So let's try and create our own little ecosystem that we can in some ways promote and control. And that is something that I think is going to happen, unfortunately. I hope it doesn't, as I said earlier, but I think in reality, it may. And so while we work on plan A, we may have to think about a plan B for many of the companies or entrepreneurship ventures that say, if this does happen, does it actually shut down your business? Is it a fatal blow? Or could you find a workaround around it?
Very good. Thank you very much. Anjali?
I quite concur. It is a worrying trend. We are seeing political boundaries actually harden. At a time when it seemed like the flows of capital and information were easing around the world, we are seeing the physical boundaries, and now increasingly the virtual boundaries start to harden as well, and data nationalization or localization is a part of that. On the other side, one does hear, even from sort of large companies that are high on innovation, as well as, in general, if you look at India, what's the raw material that India has? The tremendous talent, the largest young population in the world, a very large market, and consequently very large data sets. So whether it's in healthcare or it is in payments and remittances and financial behavior, social behavior when it comes to social media and so on, all of that generates data. Now, who does that data belong to? Does it belong to the consumer? And I know this is the question that's being raised around the world right now. Does it belong to the large platforms on which the consumer interacts? Where is the value capture coming from that data? Who captures the value? Is that a public good? Is it an individual good? Or does it belong to the corporates, big or small, that operate those platforms? So these are very big questions right now, I think, in the both social and policy arena, and certainly coming into the economic and corporate arena as well.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Who benefits from that data? If data is the new oil, who benefits from it?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. It is indeed very much top of mind in every country, particularly those that have the dynamism of that entrepreneurial sector and the amount of data. that is being generated and can be used. And I see, serving on MasterCard board and others, particularly MasterCard, but the incredible emphasis that's going into protecting data integrity, and as well as necessary transparency and cybersecurity, which Sharad referenced, because building that trust and confidence is essential for this digital world we're moving into, and building the building blocks of that, whether it's around digital identity or the integrity of networks or other such features, are what will give you confidence. Confidence can be lost, and that sort of trust, both in the corporations and in the resilience of systems, is crucial, I think, to the evolution of this world. Were you wishing to make a
I just wanted
comment?
to add, I wanted to clarify, thank you, Merit. I wanted to clarify that when I say who benefits from the data, I think it is less, it's not a question of whether it's a big company, small company, or it's a global company / Indian company, or in any country, it is a global company / local company. I think just a very fundamental question that is emerging now. Is it a public good, individual good, or belongs to any corporate? Local, multinational, whatever, right? So I think that's the question really about.
Thank you.
And if we move into a multiverse or a metaverse, do national boundaries really matter?
Yes, those are fantastic questions. I want us to really have a global dialogue on this set of questions. I am beginning to see some incoming questions from participants, and I have quite a few more myself. But to give deference to a lot of expertise on this call, let me turn to these. And let me first raise the one to each of you. What is the one wish that each of you would have to exponentially enable entrepreneurship among, highly experienced, I would say it says experienced professionals, but I would say, dynamic talent that exists in India? What's the one wish each of you would put forward? Who'd like to start?
I can start. Ease of doing business.
Sharad, did you start?
Yeah.
I didn't hear you.
I said ease of doing business. So while every year you hear that India has improved its ease of doing business, but on the ground there's very marginal improvement, right? Needs to be a lot more to start a business in India, to sustain it. The number of agencies that audit you, the number of clearances and permissions you need is not. It doesn't matter who the government is. It is nothing political. It's basically we still have the red tape and bureaucracy that exists, and there has been an improvement, but there's a lot of way to go. So I think to enable more entrepreneurship, you just have to exponentially improve the ease of doing business.
Thank you. That's terrific. Noshir, how about you?
So the question is very interesting because it's addressed to professionals, and I was thinking about that quite a lot. And I think if I had one wish, I would actually say, we talk a lot about the economic opportunity. We talk a lot about the new technology, deep tech, whatever it is. I think we're forgetting that there is a massive amount of things that digital and technology can do for socially moving the country. And I'd love to see more ventures, more focus on whether it's the 400 million that I talked about or something else, right, that could really leapfrog India from always being tagged on as this, developing country and to do something really for the social side of our work, not just the economic.
Thank you very much. I'd like to come back to that in a minute. Anjali, how about you?
I'll start with an anecdote. Even 10 years ago, it would have been quite difficult for a young man to find a bride if he didn't have a job. If he worked for a 1-year-old company, a so-called startup, And we used to see, and we had these sort of, but real situations. They're funny, but real, where somebody would go take a job because he had to go tell his prospective father-in-law that I have a job and a paycheck. Today, it is not the case. It is absolutely acceptable and in fact cool to have a girl, your daughter or your son marry, or either do a startup, not get a job, or marry somebody who's doing a startup, right? So in that sense, the social acceptance is so strong that there is no longer a taboo or a social barrier, attitudinal societal barrier for somebody to not get a job. So I don't know who's asked the question about professionals. I think India is a nation of entrepreneurs. Whether it is your chaiwala or your dudwala, bhajiwala, andawala, or it is your biggest industrialist, like two of the world's wealthiest folks are now in India, right? So I don't think it is a question of professionals becoming entrepreneurs. It's risk appetite, availability of capital, the lowering of social barriers and burdens on sometimes not earning that much or a stable income. I agree with Sharad. We have made tremendous progress on ease of doing business, but we have the opportunity to make even more progress on ease of doing business. I'm a bit of an optimist, so I always think glass half full, but hey, it can be fully full, not by only half full. On solving social problems, I think the biggest opportunity really that we have as an ecosystem, entrepreneurial ecosystem in India, and I, for one, am excited about this. I don't see this as a problem. I'm very excited about this, is I now see this version 3.0 of Indian startups address the large problems of Bharat. Whether it is building on the India Stack rails for social inclusion, we are seeing new models of microfinance and less than prime lending emerge, for example, or in the agricultural space, regardless of policy and regulation, whatever the political system might want, agricultural supply chains are getting digitized. So they will empower farmers, they will help improve farm incomes, for example. Food processing is seeing a lot of investment, both policy supported and otherwise, just entrepreneurial. The 400 million blue-grey collar workers, your unskilled, semi-skilled workers. We are seeing both public platforms like Desh, linking everything, Desh, Unnati, NCS, and so on, but also a bunch of startups in the last 5 years. There's Apna, there's Bandhu, there's Better Place, and these are just a few that are creating real commercial models. So I'll finish in just half a minute more. But the way to solve this is, in my personal view, is through creating commercially scalable, sustainable business models that are not dependent on quote unquote impact capital or sort of SOPs. Because take MSMEs, for example. We talk about MSMEs all the time in India. As an MSME today in that sector, if they don't digitize and adopt the new way of doing business, the difference between WOFs and children grow up. Okay? So that's so going back, I think there is power in entrepreneurship. A lot of these problems will get solved. There is need for capital, catalytic capital. That is the risk capital that you mentioned, Merit, earlier as well, and to support areas that have longer gestation.
Well, thank you very much. I see questions are coming into different formats, so I haven't captured them all, but in our last 3 minutes, I'm going to mention them and invite each of you to comment on one of them, if you don't mind, very, very briefly for just one moment. One question is an economics one, is in promoting fundamental research, is this a good use of scarce resources? I'd like to direct that to Sharad. And second is a question on India's tech and digital policy. If you think about the key underpinnings in a 25-year perspective, could I direct that to Noshir? And then there's a question also about sustainability, and that's really something Anjali has been investing in. So what is, where's the space for exploration of sustainability startups? So could I invite each of you to take those on with a 1-minute thought and appreciate these are hard questions to answer in a minute, but they pick up on themes we've all discussed. Fantastic conversation, starting with Sharad.
Yeah, excellent question. I understand that if there are scarce resources, one could think twice of investing in technologies that might not fructify ever or take 10, 15 years to fructify. But I think it's long-term thinking versus short-term thinking. And I believe that we should think long-term. So there needs to be some portion of the budget that is a significant portion of the budget. Now, one could argue that US could probably devote more of that because that's a bigger economy. But I think we are not doing enough. I think we can do more in that space. I think if we think long-term, just like we did with the India Stack, right? We did that. That's not happened overnight. That innovation of the UPI, Aadhaar, and DigiLocker and all these tools took over a decade. Right? They took 10 years to reach where they reached. So it is innovation that happened. That platform took some time. So similarly, if you're looking at some fundamental research, it will take time, but it is a long-term thinking versus short-term thinking. So I think we should do more than what we're doing, even though the resources are scarce.
Thank you very much. It's very helpful. Noshir.
25 years is a long time, but let me give it a shot. I would love for us to think. I fundamentally believe that in our working lifetime, India will emerge as a technology superpower. And like all superpowers, I really wish that we use that, whatever talent or whatever capabilities we've developed as a result, to improve the world and not create these barriers that we talked about, right? Open technology, open source, right? I think if India could show in becoming the technology superpower, in the rise of India's capability on that front, I wonder if we could show a new operating model to the world that does not have to be win-lose.
Thank you very much. Anjali.
I think I would say ditto on both. We still need to and should invest scarce resources because then they are used really well when they're scarce. The best startups come up when they have, we say that more startups die of indigestion than starvation, right? So I think even if resources are scarce, they do need to go into space tech, into agri-tech, into health tech, into going into Bharat. Just as we don't think about building roads, ports, and physical infrastructure, then the second point hence is India's big innovation, global innovation is the public digital infrastructure. And as we emerge, I think we are emerging now as a global tech superpower. Hopefully we make use of our tremendous sort of demographic dividend, just like India created the big IT services industry. Why can't we create the big ML AI industry as well coming out of India? So new skills for the next generation, the next, as the Honorable Prime Minister calls it, the Amrit Kal for the next 25 years. Big opportunity ahead. I am an optimist. So I think that when we see the opportunity, there will be entrepreneurs that will emerge to grasp that opportunity and make a lot of it.
Thank you very much. What a wonderful conversation. I share your, I know so little, but I have such a tremendous interest in and appreciation for the dynamism in the Indian economy and the role of entrepreneurship, and particularly in this digital space, how financial inclusion is being turned into tremendous opportunities for innovation as well. So what a rich conversation along many dimensions. Thank you so much. And Arvind, over to you.
Great. Thank you, Merit. That was absolutely fantastic. And so my heartfelt thanks to all four. Thanks for making the time. And I hope we can get back to you sometime again when we host something similar. So thank you all. I would have liked to raise a question on the scaling up problem that India has. We seem not to be able to scale up at the global level. And something was said about, the frugal innovation, but that's a double-edged sword, that frugal innovation solves a local problem. But really, at the end of the day, we need to become really globally big. And that is where I think the big challenge seems to remain. Great. So we will move to the next session. But before that, I want to invite our benefactor and patron, Mr. Deepak Raj, because we will miss him tomorrow. He is traveling to India tomorrow. So I just wanted to have a word from him. I also want to recognize Mr. Sridhar Menon, who is here. Actually, I later saw him yesterday as well. He has been with us throughout. Just so that you know why I'm especially recognizing Mr. Menon is he is the major donor of the Jagdish Bhagwati Chair on Indian Political Economy, which I hold. So, Sridhar, great to have you here as well. So, Deepak, a word from you. There is Sridhar, Mr. Menon. You're mute.
Yeah, sorry. Okay. So thank you, Arvind. My friend Sridhar and I would like to congratulate you on this terrific summit. We found the papers presented yesterday to be very valuable. The conversation with Uday Kotak was terrific. And the session we just had with Merit Jeno was truly outstanding. Thank you, Merit, for moderating this session. Great to see you. And for those of you who might not know, although I think we've talked about it a little bit before, Merit just completed a highly successful tenure as a Dean of SEPA, handing over the reins recently to Interim Dean Tom Christensen. Merit is a world-renowned specialist in trade, is a highly respected leader in business, non-executive chair of the board at MasterCard, and several other organizations she's intimately involved with. I'll let you in on a little secret. You know, the two reasons we established a center at Columbia were Merit Jeno's support and, of course, Arvind Panagaria and the mentorship of Professor Bhagwati. So, Merit, thank you for all your support and guidance over the years. You have helped shape the center, and it is hugely appreciated. The center was established a few years ago, as you know. For the initial 3 years, Arvind was called to duty by the Prime Minister to be the vice chair of the newly formed Niti Aayog. And while Arvind was away, Professor Bhagwati led the center's activities. And now, under Arvind's leadership, there have been several events all towards informing the dialogue on growth of the Indian economy. There has been terrific progress. Thank you so much to Arvind and everybody else for that. And we would just like to let you know that we are fully committed to making sure the center has a bright future. Thank you to all the presenters, and thank you, Arvind, for a terrific summit. Back over to you.
Thank you, Deepak. Thank you very much. Thanks for your continued support, without which, of course, we will not be here. And safe travels tomorrow or tonight, perhaps you're leaving. So I hope all goes well. All goes well. Okay, so we can now move to the next session, which is going to be chaired by Prachi Mishra. Prachi, I hope, is here. I thought I saw her just now.
Hello, Professor Panagaria.
Hi, Prachi. So Prachi, of course, is a Columbia PhD. So we have a direct link and line to Prachi. But of course, you know, she has gone on to do many, many bigger and more important things. She has been at the IMF on a long-term basis, but she also served as the chief economist at Goldman Sachs, right, in India. And you have also been the director of research or was it at the Institute at the Reserve Bank of India. She's also very well published in professional journals as well as policy journals. So great pleasure to have you, Prachi, and it's over to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Panagaria. It's pleasure is all mine. I think it's unfortunately I've not been able to catch up with the conference, but hopefully I can do it. But from what I see, it's an excellent forum for discussion on India issues. So good morning, everyone. My name is Prachi Mishra, as Professor Panagaria said. I will be chairing the session on credit constraints and bankruptcy law. And as you know, one of the major reforms of this government has been the introduction of the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code in 2016. So we have Nandini Gupta from Indiana, who will be presenting joint work with Khushbu Thakkar on the topic. So Nandini, very much looking forward to it. This is, an evaluation this is perhaps, correct me if I'm wrong, the first systematic, rigorous evaluation of the IBC, and we look forward to seeing the empirics. So you have 35 minutes, Nandini. And our discussant is Meghna Iyagari. I can see Meghna as well. So we'll follow with the discussion. So Nandini, over to you for 35 minutes, and then we'll move over to Meghna.
All right. Thanks so much, Prachi. And can everyone see the screen?
Yeah, we can.
Okay, great. So I want to thank Arvind for inviting me to speak in this conference. I learned a lot over the last day and a half, so it's been really great. I also want to thank Meghna, who's been very patient, waiting for some material for me to send to her so she can discuss. I really look forward to your comments, Meghna. And this paper is this project so far is co-authored with Khushbu Thakkar, who's a PhD student in economics at the University of North Carolina, and she's been absolutely fantastic for anybody who's looking to hire in the next few years. Also, I want to mention the fact that this is very preliminary, so any comments you have would be very welcome. So without further ado, let me go ahead and get started. Is everything working properly with the screen and so on?
Nandini, a little bit, it's cut on the, at least in my view.
Seems to be that way. Hang on, sorry, there's always a little bit of something. So let me just make sure it's fine.
And I would please request whoever is not talking to mute themselves, because I think there is a little bit of background noise as well.
Let me see what I can do here. Try again. Is that a little better?
Perfect. This is perfect.
Okay, great. Okay, so when Arvind, one of the topics that when Arvind suggested, in fact, that I could perhaps look at the IBC, I thought that was really interesting because I have an earlier paper co-authored with Todd Gormley and Anand Chow, where we looked at one of the prior laws that was replaced by the IBC, the Sikh Industrial Companies Act of India. And I just wanted to point out a couple of things that are relevant. One is that the key difference between the SICA Act, which basically allowed companies to file for bankruptcy with the BIFR, the main bankruptcy court, was that the main difference of the IBC was that this was a debtor in possession system. And once a company filed with the BIFR, there was an automatic stay on assets. So creditors could no longer try and recover assets. And as you can see from the picture on the right, this process, and not just SICA, but basically every single bankruptcy, all the multitude of bankruptcy processes that were in place before IBC led to very long delays. And according to the World Bank, for example, in India, it took about 4.5 years compared to, let's say, 1 year or less in developed countries. But in practice, it actually took a longer time. So what we found in that paper was that that pressure from creditors led to strategic filing for bankruptcy by firms because of this debtor in possession automatic stay on assets. And this is something that we look at, or that will change with the new law. So let me set the stage a little bit. The IBC, or the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code, was passed in 2016. And the first bankruptcy courts started operating in 2017. So just prior to that, there had been this decline in credit growth. So this is data from the RBI. And so credit growth had been declining for a few years prior to that. On the other hand, non-performing loans as a percentage of total loans had been going up. So the IBC was actually set up to, first of all, simplify the bankruptcy process, but very much keeping in mind this idea of non-performing loans in the banking system, which were affecting the financial stability of the system. So in this preliminary study, we're going to focus on borrowing and see whether that has been affected by the passage of the IBC. So a few
we have some noise coming. If somebody has their speaker on, please mute them.
Right. I hope it's not me. I don't think so, but nope, I don't have any other Zoom things open. So should I try a different speaker, or is it someone who's...
It's slightly from you, Nandini, because everyone,
okay.
Professor Panagiri, maybe you can mute yourself as well, and I'll mute because I think you, Nandini, and I are the only ones who are unmuted, so we can mute ourselves and try. Yeah, I think it's fine now. Nandini, please go ahead.
Okay. All right. So, doing okay with the sound?
No, unfortunately, no, because there is still.
Okay.
So probably it's coming from you.
You think after all these years of Zoom, it would be better now, but apparently not.
But let's go ahead, I think.
Can you hear me? Is the sound any better?
We can hear you, but I think there is like in the background, like a banging sound or something, which at least I'm hearing.
Is that better?
It's still there. I think we should carry on. I can still hear you. We can see the slides, so I think we should carry on.
Not sure. I don't know what exactly is going on, but I managed to turn off everything. Sorry for the technical difficulties.
By the way, if you have your cell phone near you, you should not keep the cell phone.
Can I turn that off? Sorry. So is it a little better? No?
Let's go ahead. I think we can still hear you and we can still see.
Okay. All right. So let me see where I was. Okay. So before the IBC was before the code was passed in 2016. The bankruptcy process in India, for want of a better description, was really messy. So, for example, Arvind in his 2008 book, as well as a few studies, talked about the fact that the liquidation and rehabilitation proceedings took 10 to 15 years once the high courts took over and started educating the liquidation process. So, why would this be a problem? Well, because a lot of asset value was eroded as a result. So creditors ended up getting nothing, and the firms, in fact, were beyond rehabilitation because of these long delays. The other problem with the bankruptcy process before IBC is that there were a multitude of laws and processes in place. So, for example, Sarfezi, which was studied by Vikrant Big in his 2013 paper, under Sarfezi, secured creditors could seize, secured debt. But what Vikrant showed in his paper was that this, as a result, total debt fell and liquidity hoarding increased and so on and so forth. So this created a disincentive for firms to invest and borrow and so on. Sujata Visaria looked at another law, which was the DRT Act, which set up these debt recovery tribunals. And her paper shows that, yes, they reduced delinquency, but the DRT courts were sort of plagued by judicial vacancies and delays and so on. So the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Act was created primarily to reduce NPAs, but also to sort of consolidate all these different bankruptcy processes that were simultaneously in place and were contributing to the delays. So without going into too much detail, since we have lost a bit of time here, the IBC basically created this new ecosystem, which I think is kind of interesting. And I think that's going to be very interesting to study. So there's 4 pillars. There are these bankruptcy courts, and there's the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Board of India, which is where we got our data from to study the cases. Then these insolvency professionals, and I found this in particular to be quite interesting. So these are the people or the professionals who are in charge of carrying out the bankruptcy process, and they are registered, and they have to take an exam, as with many things in India, which is administered by the regulator, the IBBI. And the number of insolvency professionals, I think, went from a very low number to about 4,000 in December 2020. So that is something which has contributed to this new ecosystem. It's a brand new law. It's been amended several times as well, to take into account the fact that it has inadvertent effects that need to be addressed. All right. So how does the bankruptcy process work? It initially said, if there's a default of 1 lakh or more, that number has subsequently been revised to a crore, which for people not familiar with Indian units, it's about 10 million rupees. So, and then the way it works is if there's a default, there's an application, to the NCLT, the bankruptcy court, for initiating a corporate insolvency resolution process against the firm. What we found in the data is that 51% of such claims were filed by operational creditors, and about 43% by financial creditors. So a bunch of defaults by, essentially on trade credit and that sort of thing. So not all claims filed with the NCLTs are in fact accepted into the process. So once they're accepted, then here is where a key difference sets in. This is a creditor in possession system or process, which means that once the NCLT accepts the firm into the bankruptcy process, the board of directors are suspended. Okay, so this is a very big difference from the previous system. And an insolvency professional is appointed who basically manages the firm, potentially with the input of managers. But the firm, the promoters of the firm are no longer in charge. And then the IBC was required to complete this process in about 330 days with the creation of committee of creditors and so on and so forth. All right, so let's take a closer look at some of these bankruptcy cases. And this data is from the IBBI, the regulator in the IBC process. So this is data from the beginning of the system when the courts were first set up. And this data is for the end of year of each of these years. So you see this peak and fall because there was a moratorium in March of 2020 until 2021 on bankruptcies because of COVID. So there was a large, high peak or sharp peak in the number of cases. I want to draw your attention to a couple of things. One is I want you to look at the withdrawn cases. I think that's kind of interesting. It's not something we focused on in this paper, but I find this very interesting. And I think what this suggests is, or what's going on here is that companies and their creditors are working out, a debt payment system once the creditor files with the IBC. So, and this is, I'm editorializing here, but I think this might be because of the creditor in possession system that the IBC has in place, because the managers and the promoters of the firm are no longer in charge of the firm. So once there's a filing, now this reduces the incentive for strategic default. Another thing I want you to look at is, of course, the liquidations versus the resolution. So the number of liquidations, in fact, is far higher. And we're actually going to look at this as well. Just a quick summary of some of the analysis that's been done so far about the IBC in the popular press, as well as discussions in the parliament and so on. First of all, the time to resolve insolvency. This is a big improvement. This data, in my opinion, is incomplete because a number of cases that have been filed have still not been, there's a lot of open cases still that have not been admitted into the process and so on. So that I don't think this includes that number. But still, it's definitely an improvement over the previous systems. Another thing that I already pointed out is more liquidations and resolutions. One thing I want to mention here, because we've been looking at liquidations, is that 61% or the majority of these liquidations were in fact demanded by the committee of creditors. Okay, so this is something that the creditors were requesting. And the other thing I want to mention a bit about the liquidations is that it's worth keeping an eye on is that there was a hangover from previous bankruptcy systems, so the BIFR and so on. So a number of these firms are already defunct, like something like 75% and so were already defunct. Once that hangover of prior bankruptcy cases, once that goes down, what's going to happen with liquidations? I think that's interesting. Here's another thing that's a cause for concern. The average recovery rate is about 31%. For most developed countries, it's about 80 cents on the dollar. So this is quite low. And again, it might have something to do with the fact that there's a lot of companies that are holdovers from the previous system. But again, it also might have to do with the fact that this is a new law. And again, I mentioned the new professionals who are involved with this process, and they might not be experienced yet. All right, so a lot of cases are still pending. Another thing we're going to look at is that there's a lot of vacancies. So 50% of the positions are vacant at the bankruptcy courts. A quick look at the distribution of the benches and where they're located. The red dots represents the benches, and the shaded areas, the regions that come under that jurisdiction. So this was in 2017, and then basically the number of benches increased as a total of 16 benches along with the principal bench in Delhi. And here's a quick look at the number of cases that are under each of these benches. The largest number of cases are in Delhi. There's 5 benches there, followed by Mumbai and Chennai, and then Kolkata. So one of the things we're going to do is look at this variation in the caseload across the different benches based on the location of firms, and see whether that makes a difference to the borrowing behavior of firms. And here's a quick look at the decisions rendered by these different benches. In particular, I just focused on the liquidations and resolutions, and as you can see, there's quite a bit of variation across the different benches, which we are also going to exploit in the data. So jumping ahead to firm level borrowing, we use data from Prowess, the CMI database, which covers primarily medium and large size firms in India. And we have data on about 30,000 firms. And so when we looked at the total borrowing behavior by these firms in this data, as you can see, total borrowing did not increase dramatically after the IBC. So one of the things we want to look at is whether the IBC eased credit constraints for particular groups of firms. So that's going to be the focus of the rest of this presentation. So essentially what we want to study is whether if the IBC strengthened creditor rights, then this should ease borrowing constraints for the more credit constrained firms. So we're going to be focusing on that aspect of the IBC. So the first question we ask is whether low liquidity, low credit rating firms, do they happen to borrow more after the passage of the IBC? We also look at firm level ownership. So if given the idea that public sector firms have soft budget constraints, does the passage of the IBC make it easier for private sector firms to borrow? We also look at whether firms whose lead lenders have very high non-performing assets, whether their borrowing constraints are eased once creditor rights are strengthened as a result of the IBC. And last of all, we connect this data to the bankruptcy courts and the cases adjudicated through those courts. And we look at whether borrowing changes based on the court's caseload, as well as the decisions rendered. So I don't want to bore you too much with the econometrics. Again, this is preliminary. We do a different analysis controlling for some firm level fixed effects, as well as region time or industry time level fixed effects. And let me just show you the first set of results. So we look at low liquidity firms as measured by current ratio, and current ratio essentially captures the ability of firms to meet their short-term liabilities. And so the firms that have a low current ratio are at greater distress risk. So what we on the left is the regression results in a chart. What we have here is our results suggest that low liquidity firms essentially increase their borrowing substantially after the passage of the IBC compared to before the IBC. So this dotted line represents firms firms that have low current ratio, whereas high liquidity firms are not that as affected by the passage of the IBC. They increase their borrowing slightly, but not as much as the low liquidity firms. So it appears that after the passage of the IBC, firms that have low liquidity are more credit constrained, increase their borrowing. It's always interesting to look at the time trend of of these patterns to see if we're capturing the effect of the IBC or something else. And here, for example, you can see that the borrowing behavior prior to the passage in 2017 is slightly different for high liquidity versus low liquidity firms. And there's initially a dip. So in 2018, for low liquidity firms, the borrowing does not go up at once. So the question remains: is this really about IBC or something else? We'd like to think it's about IBC because after that it's does seem to increase. We would like to have a more airtight story about why it doesn't kick in right away. And this might be, and we are going to explore this, and this might be because it takes time for these courts to sort of get into business and for creditors to in fact get experience with the process. Okay. So just to give you a sense of the numbers, and this is the only table I show you, I promise. So for example, in column 3, where we have region year fixed effects and so on to control, and firm level fixed effects to control for whatever else might be going on in this state over time and this firm. If you compare a firm that's in the 25th percentile of liquidity versus a firm in the 75th percentile, the low liquidity firm is borrowing about 25% more relative to the mean level of borrowing compared to the high liquidity firm after the passage of IBC, which is quite substantial. So we followed up with this liquidity results by looking at the rating codes, and this is available for a far smaller sample of firms because rating codes are a relatively new concept in India. And here what we find is consistent with our prior results. In particular, we find that after the passage of the IBC, so this gray line with the diamonds represents the post-IBC borrowing, low credit rating firms, appear to borrow a little more after the passage of the IBC than before. And in fact, if you look at the high credit rating firms, relatively speaking, they're borrowing less after the post-IBC period. So once again, I might be pushing the inference here too much, and I want to be cautious about that. But there appears to be potentially a redistribution of bank lending, because remember, we saw that the aggregate borrowing numbers are not changing as much, but some of these higher risk firms appear to be borrowing more after the passage of IBC. Another thing we looked at is whether or not the characteristics of the lead lender matter. So in particular, we connect firms to the lead lender of firms to the RBI data on non-performing assets, and we look at whether firms borrow more based on whether their lead lender has more NPAs or fewer NPAs after the passage of the IBC. And here, the 0 right here represents before IBC, and the 1 right here represents post IBC. And what we find is that the high NPA lenders and the low NPA lenders both increase lending, or I should say firms that borrow from either group both groups borrow more, but the ones who borrow from high NPA lenders appear to borrow even more after the passage of IBC. So if one can think about those who borrow from lead lenders being more credit constrained, then after the passage of IBC, when creditor rights are strengthened, it appears that their borrowing increases. So this is all, lining up. All right. So another thing, which of course I'm very interested in, is the role of ownership, and in particular, government-owned firms versus private firms, and so on and so forth, and whether their borrowing behavior changes. And we looked at, private firms and business group and foreign firms, with the excluded category being government-owned firms. And what we find there is, once again, that the private firms and business group firms appear to increase their borrowing after the passage of the IBC. Some of that result actually becomes weaker once we control for whatever is going on at the industry year level, and it appears to be then that only the business group firms are improving their borrowing, which is a bit of a mixed message in the sense that We would like to think that if credit constraints are being eased across ownership groups, and the standalone private firms would do better than government-owned firms. And they are in most of the specifications, but it's worth investigating whether there's something else going on that would make this result a little bit weaker. So overall, it appears that credit constraints are eased when the IBC is passed. We also wanted to connect the data to what's going on with the particular bankruptcy courts, the NCLT courts. And one of the things we did, while not every state has an NCLT court, as I mentioned, there's 15 benches, and these were introduced, a few more were introduced over time, about 5 additional benches. So we tried to exploit that staggered introduction of a bankruptcy court in your state, and to see whether this might affect your borrowing. And once again, we compared the low liquidity with the high liquidity firms, or as measured by current ratio. And when there's no bankruptcy court in your state, then the high liquidity firms borrow more compared to the low liquidity firms. But once there is a bankruptcy court, then the low liquidity firms borrow more, so increase their borrowing relative to the high liquidity firms. So apparently, distance to the court matters. So that's what these results suggest. One of the persistent criticisms of the delays in the bankruptcy process for the IBC has been the large number of vacancies, which has supposedly compounded the delays. And so what we wanted to look at is whether the caseload of the individual courts matters for borrowing constraints. So what we looked at was basically the number of cases filed with the particular bankruptcy court where the firm is located. And we look at that over time. The idea being that if there's a high caseload, then potentially this implies weaker creditor rights, because it's going to take longer for a creditor to recover their debt. So here we compare the low caseload, the solid line courts, with the high caseload of the dotted line courts, and we have low liquidity firms versus high liquidity firms along the x-axis. And when the caseload is low liquidity firms borrow more than when the caseload is high. So if you just look at the left side of the axis here, apparently a high caseload is correlated with with borrowing of low liquidity firms. For the high liquidity firms, it's not that much of a difference whether it's a high caseload or a low caseload court. So once again, this speaks to making potentially the process a bit more efficient by filling up some of those bench vacant positions. So
sorry to interrupt, 5 more minutes for you.
Oh, perfect. So I'm almost done. So the last result that we look at in this context is the liquidation decisions. And in particular, I think one of the things I wanted to repeat was the fact that the courts were issuing more liquidation decisions than resolutions decisions where firms would work out their debt. And this came under some criticism because the idea of the IBC was that they wanted to resurrect firms and basically keep them as going concerns. But at the same time, what we found was that the bulk of these liquidation requests were being made by creditors. So if a court is willing to issue liquidation decisions, we wanted to see whether this is interpreted by creditors as a good thing, as basically stronger creditor rights. And what we find seems to suggest that. So in particular, low liquidity firms borrow more if they're located in a district with a high number of liquidations, and as opposed to a district with a low number of liquidations. And so that's, all of this basically seems to suggest that what's going on at the court level and the bankruptcy court level does affect or is affecting the borrowing behavior of firms and, of course, the lending behavior of banks, which we have not yet looked at except through the firms. So all of this is, of course, preliminary, but I think quite interesting, and I would love to see what Meghna's comments are. So just to sum up, the IBC has reduced the time spent in insolvency, and having studied the bankruptcy process before, just the sheer large number of competing regulations and processes in place were, getting rid of that and subsuming that, I think, is a huge improvement. So I think the withdrawn cases, this is something that should be studied more. I think that's really interesting, the fact that strategic default appears to be affected. And our results suggest that liquidity constrained firms, private firms and so on, firms whose lead lenders have more NPAs, and they borrow more after the passage of the IBC. And lastly, it appears that the caseload and the number of open cases in the bankruptcy court and the speed of the resolution process, as well as the decisions of the bankruptcy court, like liquidations versus other outcomes, these appear to affect the incentives of lenders and thereby borrowing by firms. So thank you very much. I will stop here.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Nandini, for the excellent presentation. So Meghna, our discussant is Meghna Ayagari from George Washington University. So Meghna, over to you, 15 minutes, please.
Great. Let me just... can you all see my slides?
Yes.
Perfect. Thank you all for joining us today, and thank you to the organizers, to Dr. Panagaria, for inviting me to be part of this panel. It's my first time at the conference, and I've really enjoyed my time for the past day and a half. I've learned a lot, and looking forward to the discussion tomorrow as well. Okay, so bankruptcy reforms and credit constraints. So before I jump into my comments on the paper, let me just sort of go back to some of the initial slides that Nandini showed about the context for why this IBC was such a landmark legislation, right? So as you can see here, I mean, this is data from the World Bank's World Development Indicators. One of the big sort of problems in the banking system in India was the huge number of NPLs, right? So the blue line here is showing you the time series progression of NPLs, reaching sort of all-time highs by like 2016. And you have the passage of IBC. I think the first cases start coming into play around August of 2016 and so on. And, the NPL ratio starts declining. So clearly this was, having some bite, because you see that, it was moving the needle on the bank NPL to gross loans. We don't have data, unfortunately, or surprisingly or not surprisingly, on the lower and middle income countries across the world, but you can compare it for the US, and you see that we definitely are an outlier in terms of these NPL ratios, right? Another way to look at this system is to also look at the time to resolve insolvency. And here, the green line you see here is really about the insolvency process for lower middle income countries and low income countries. And we outrank them even there, right? So our time to resolve insolvency was around 4.5 years for the longest time. And again, post passage of IBC, you see that there seems to be some bite. The IBC happening in 2016, and thereafter, sort of 2018 onwards, you see that this drops to almost 1.5 years. So this seems sort of to be legislation that's really proving to be this one-stop shop solution for resolving insolvencies. And Nandini went over this in detail, but just to highlight some of the key things that happened under this process was that there was going to be a maximum time limit, right? It was going to be 180 days for companies, extendable by like 90 days. So the whole process was supposed to be completed within like 270 days. And as she said, there was this whole institution around this insolvency regime that came into place. You have this IBBI, you have this new sort of profession that's come up, which is this insolvency professionals. You have a committee of creditors that's going to sort of orchestrate the whole thing. And most importantly, you have a primary adjudicating authority, which is this national company law tribunals, right? So this, in summary, was sort of some of the key features of this legislation. So what does this paper find? So it's looking at a sort of, what is a comprehensive view of IBC on firms, right? I mean, we've been looking at anecdotal evidence so far. That data has been very mixed. So this is a paper that, says, okay, let's look at what's happening to firms. So on the borrowers, what they find is that borrowing increases for following the passage of IBC for the liquidity constrained firms and for the low credit rating firms. They also have some results showing that the business group firms are borrowing more than the state-owned firms. On the lending side, even though they're looking at it from the firm side, the suggestion is that the lenders with higher NPAs are increasing lending. There's important finding on judicial capacity. So borrowing by low liquidity firms is lower when the courts are more busy, when there's higher caseloads. And interestingly, there seems to be a story that if a bankruptcy court is making more liquidation decisions, then the borrowing by these low liquidity firms is actually going to be higher, right? So these are sort of some of the main findings of the paper. As she said, this is very much a work in progress. It's a very preliminary look at how these financing patterns are evolving over time post IBC. So I think there's some very cool stuff here. So most of my comments are really going to be on, next steps and sort of urging the authors to think a little bit more about, in which dimensions can we, open up the black box on this financing schemes a little bit more. Okay. So my first comment is, in this overall graph on total borrowing, right? If I look at this overall graph, it seems like total borrowing seems to have gone down post IBC. This is a graph right from the paper. I mean, there's an anomaly after 2020. Who knows what's happening there, right? If it's like infusion of credit because of COVID, any moratorium that's being imposed on these bankruptcy proceedings. So it would be nice to just look at this. I'm not sure if this was done at the firm level with, all your firm fixed effects and so on. It'd be good to see, what exactly is happening to, total corporate debt, right? And, really try and understand what are the supply and demand factors that are influencing this, right? What do we expect? I think identification going forward will be key in sort of understanding, is it, banks applying more, what's happening on the demand side, and really grounding this in terms of what we know about the theory about, bankruptcy reform, right? Because on one hand, you look at the whole law and finance literature, starting from Laporta and so on. They will tell you that, once you have creditor rights strengthened, it's empowering the creditors to enforce contracts. So what they do is that they would result in a reduction of borrowing costs, it alleviates financing constraints, and so it fosters greater financial development. So this is the big case for strengthening investor protection, right? It's the big case for why bankruptcy reform is going to have a positive outcome. And people have shown that it's not just overall lending, but also long-term lending, right? The debt maturity changes in the economy. The paper showing that it's greater long-term debt. Visaria's paper talks about, and highlighted in blue because it's specifically to the Indian context, they show that there is reduced delinquency rates. So this is the good side of the bankruptcy reform. But the not so good side is the idea that if you go back to early bankruptcy theory, if creditor rights are too excessive, then you could have ex post inefficiencies in the form of a liquidation bias. And this is exactly some of the data, what the data is actually showing, that there's an increase in liquidations, right? So this would actually have a negative impact on firms' demand for credit. And we know this from some of the early work, right? Like Wigg's paper talks about how there was a overall decrease in not just secure debt, but total debt after the Sarfaci Act. I saw some recent work by a couple of folks at the RBI suggesting that there is something similar going on after, IBC as well. And importantly, it's not just the capital structure decisions. Viral Acharya has a couple of papers showing that, firms actually start taking on less risky investments. So the idea being that it reduces the demand for credit, it discourages risk taking. So firms are actually now foregoing profitable investments and maybe even making value decreasing investments, right? So there's also an impact on the investment side. So the first comment would be to go back and look at this a little bit more carefully, grounding it in theory and trying to understand what should be the effects of IBC, both from the supply and the demand side. Okay. Second comment on this would really be about the distributional consequences. So you see a lot of firm heterogeneity in the patterns that Nandini was presenting, right? But here again, why do we see these low credit rating firms being able to access more credit? Is it that they're credit constrained, or is there actually a increase in supply of credit? And so the poor quality guys are actually now able to access credit, that has very different implications for, the efficiency of this bankruptcy process, right? Another thing that you might want to look at is private firms versus publicly listed firms, because the publicly listed firms have an outside option. They have equity financing available, right? So what happens post IBC? Is there a differential impact on the publicly listed guy, on the firms that are listed in the stock market versus others? And again, the RBI has some papers showing that there's variation across public sector bank lending versus private bank lending post IBC. So that may be another dimension to exploit. But I guess what I'm really pushing for is, I think the real story here is are there adverse distributional consequences for certain categories of firms, right? That's where the tension is. So the Econometrica paper by Besaria shows that, they're looking at DRT, but they basically show that while overall lending went up, it was really only for the large borrowers. Okay, so there's a partial versus general equilibrium story going on there, and they show that overall lending actually decreased for the small borrowers. So do you see some of those effects, maybe along size, maybe along sort of constrained firms versus unconstrained firms? What are the distributional consequences there? And related, you guys know this better. Nandini has a lot of work on group firms. What is it about these group firms, right? Because that would not have been my prior, that the group firms are actually able to borrow more post IBC. I mean, they're not really traditionally credit constrained. So what is the role at play? I mean, is this increased borrowing? Are you able to tease out bank debt versus internal capital market debt? Maybe that's what's happening. They're moving away from bank debt. And I also raised this question of, the current legislation, I don't think has anything to say about group insolvency, right? I mean, it seems to be just about a single firm. And from my read of it, at least, it seemed to be like the legislation is trying to play catch up, right? So there are all these big cases like the JP Group and the Lavazza Group going belly under. And then, the IBC code is sort of reforming to sort of address these special cases. So it'll be interesting to see, how group insolvency is being dealt with under the IBC, and that would actually have more implications for what happens to group borrowing, right? Busy courts. I really like this result, right? It's the idea that borrowing by your low liquidity firms is lower when the bankruptcy courts are more busy. And this fits in very nicely into this law versus enforcement literature, showing that court congestion has a big impact on firm financing, investment, restructuring. I highlight the Bohm paper again because it's using ASI data. They're not looking at bankruptcy, but they show that busy courts actually have an impact on firm supplier customer decisions as well, and their internal organizations of firms, right? So I think what is important here is that it really points to inefficiencies in the insolvency process. So I would be very interested in looking at what are some of the welfare effects of these busy courts, right? So, you highlighted some of this in the thing. It definitely seems to be a problem with, where IBC stands 5 years now, right? Because what you're seeing is that until late last year, this NCLT did not have a president. Only 34 of the sanctioned 62 judges are actually in place. 71% are going more than this allocated timeline of 180 days. So this idea that there are huge time delays seems to be, a very important concern for IBC going forward. So it would be interesting to see how this evolves. And I think a question on the side here was, I'm not sure how this works here, but is there forum shopping, right? Can creditors actually shop for more creditor-friendly courts? Like, what dictates whether you file with the Mumbai bench or the Allahabad bench or, whatever else, right? Is that allowed? I mean, we've seen some of this happening in bankruptcy courts in the US. I'm not sure how the legislation is in India, but that would be something to sort of pay attention to. My fourth comment is really on spillovers, right? Because what happens, you've had these huge landmark cases. What happens to the other firms in the industry following insolvency proceedings, right? How do they change the product market competition in the industry? And I think this is the space where a lot can be done, even in terms of the academic literature. There's been, not that much work. The way I think about it is, if you look at the Jet Airways bankruptcy case, you could expect that, this is more of spreading the misery, right? There may be direct effects of the fallout of a large firm, of a large distressed firm, or there could be sort of an information signaling effect wherein you learn more about the industry being in distress. Like one of these large bankruptcies actually tells you more about the industry. So is it more of spreading the misery and, other firms in the industry, the suppliers, the customers and competitors are also badly affected? Or do you actually see the other side wherein, the large competitors might actually benefit from it? And there seems to be some anecdotal evidence that suggests that some otherwise healthy firms are going asset shopping and picking up the distressed assets from these large bankruptcies. But the flip side of it is that they might actually be foregoing some of their own investment, right? And that brings me to my, the comment number 5, which is that financing is great. I mean, we should definitely be looking at it, but I think it very equally.
Sorry to interrupt. So 2 more minutes.
Yeah, I'm almost done. So an equally interesting comment here, outcome here to look at would be what's happening to investment choices. Because if you believe that there is a liquidation bias, what you'd expect is that firms are going to hold back risky investments, right? And there was a suggestion that, firms are doing less R&D over time, that R&D investment is not so robust from, the previous session. And I couldn't help wonder whether that's got anything to do with this bankruptcy reform that's in place as well. Okay, so key takeaway, this has been a landmark legislative reform. It's really changing the lender-borrower dynamics. It's moved from a debtor-friendly to a creditor-friendly regime. And the anecdotal evidence has been very mixed, right? I mean, you're wondering whether it's just teething troubles 5 years since the passing of this reform, or is this really going to be more of, a reform not having enough bite? And so I think a paper like this is super important. I have a couple of suggestions that I went over, but very interested in looking forward to, what the next version of this paper is going to be. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Meghna. These were really an excellent set of comments. So we can open the floor to discussion. I'll take the chair's prerogative to ask you a few things, very, maybe reflecting my ignorance. I was pretty struck by slide 7, Nandini. So this is, a couple of things. Of course, you did not speak much about it, but the sharp decline, which you see, I think that's COVID, right? So maybe you can talk a little bit about it and whether you're including those in your sample. I didn't get a sense of, so maybe, some, for the audience, what happened during COVID. And that might also shed light on Meghna's point that, teething troubles or, what are the challenges? I think from your analysis, it seems, very good positive picture of the IBC. But maybe the COVID experience highlighted some of the challenges. So you could give a more, balanced view, perhaps. So that is one thing. Second, more econometrically, I thought, when you talk about low liquidity firms, etc., are there threshold effects? That is, what is low, what is high, or you've explored those. And third is just a comment that some of the lag in the effects, I wouldn't be surprised, because these things take time, and you're looking at some of the variables on the left-hand side. There may be some lags in transmission of the effects of IBC to these variables. But with this, maybe we can open it to discussion if anybody wants to raise any questions or any comments, and then we can give some time to Nandini and Khushbu to respond. There are a couple of comments in the chat box too. Nandini, I don't know if you can see them. I can read out to you. So this is from Mr. V.V. Ranganathan. Just an observation, the data on improved borrowing in recent years, which is post-IBC, may have been influenced by higher capitalization of banks by the government. Companies with good cash flow repaying loans and become debt light and flushing in liquidity during COVID lockdowns. And cases can be filed only in the place where the registered office of the company is located. I don't see anything else unless I'm missing something on. So if not, probably Nandini.
Maybe I will ask a question. Just a broad question, both Nandini and Meghna. are we now getting close to some sort of steady state? Because, when IBC was introduced 2016, so much backlog has existed of bankruptcies that should have happened years back. Even in terms of filing behavior, etc., things have really, it was a major kind of legislation. It's the kind of legislation about which I had been writing for almost 15 years, that India needed this kind of legislation. Are we getting to some sort of steady state? And the argument I often used to make was that, look, without an easy exit, entry doesn't happen. And I used to draw this analogy with the mafia world, that if you've got no exit doors, then anybody investment behavior changing and all. So roughly, in general, if you could really give your thoughts on this, not asking for necessarily a technical, it's not really a technical question, but it's a bit more broader question.
Nandini, if I may add to Professor Panagaria's comment that, perhaps we were getting to a steady state, but then you had this COVID shock, right? So how do we even think about a steady state now, faced with this unprecedented shock? So let me stop here, and maybe unless there anybody else wants to intervene, we can hand over the floor to the authors.
Okay, so I don't know if there's still going to be static in this.
It is definitely coming from you, because when you stopped.
Yeah.
So there is some device next to you, which is, I think, creating, but it's okay. I think we should
Sorry about that. Okay, so Meghna, thank you. This is really great. I think the distributional consequences are actually going to be are actually a really important thing to look at. So we would, we definitely want to think about that. In particular, one of the things that are also interesting in this context is sort of thinking about which types of industries and firms are, being targeted for liquidations, and in particular within manufacturing, or is it, mainly manufacturing and other industrial firms? And that's something that I'm also interested in exploring, and to the extent to which asset specificity will matter as well, because this is something that, people have looked at in the bankruptcy literature. So yeah, I think these are really great suggestions. So thank you so much. I appreciate it. I also should go and look at some of those papers you mentioned from the RBI, so we'll definitely do that. So the spillovers idea, I think that's really key too. And I referenced Vikram's paper because I think this is actually critical, and this is something that I think the legislators have to think about the inefficiencies of the creditor in possession laws. So, putting so much focus on the creditor, we went from one extreme to another. So, can this be, this requires some nuance essentially. And you're absolutely right. This is going to create, potentially disincentive in terms of, taking bigger risks. So again, that's something that's very interesting. Prachi, the COVID shock, this was basically when there was a moratorium on bankruptcy in the bankruptcy courts between March 2020 and March 2021. So this is why the total cases fell dramatically, as did every, the other metrics. In terms of what that means, did the COVID shock have a different effect on particular types of firms and industries? I think we are still learning about that, and there's in fact quite a few papers that have come out recently talking about which firms and which industries have been more affected. And it's a little bit hard to it's a little bit hard to separate out, as we all know, whether this is COVID related or whether this is the bankruptcy courts, stalling of or the moratorium on the cases that's going to have an effect on subsequent, liquidation outcomes. So, but again, I don't have any particular insight into the COVID shock and which firms and industries are going to be more affected. But again, that would be, I think, something interesting to think about. Arvind, so far as a steady state goes, I think that's a really interesting question. I don't think we've reached a steady state. And again, I'm totally speculating. But I think there's basically a lot of, just from a expertise perspective, I think this is still being built. I mean, this is essentially an infrastructure bankruptcy that's being created. And this is a very new law. And, just came in place 5 years ago. They just came up with this prepackaged thing for the small and medium enterprises. And this is all going to change, I think, even more. I actually think it's encouraging that that this law is being amended, sort of in real time as different problems come up. The Supreme Court is weighing in on various issues about who has, jurisdiction over what, and so on and so forth. So no, I don't think we've reached a steady state, because I think the law is still being amended, and because I think the courts and the professionals and the judges and so on, they're still very much in training, so to speak. I mean, I think this infrastructure will keep developing. I hope that it'll keep developing and improving as we speak. So in terms of liquidations, though, I agree with you. I think there's a big hangover from previous systems. So let's hope that COVID has not created another big, set of liquidations that's going to, keep the courts busy for a number of years again. So thank you again for these comments and for the feedback. Meghna, I look forward to chatting with you more about it. And if anyone else has any other, comments or questions, feel free to reach out.
Nandini, I think a couple of more on the,
Just wanted to add to Nandini's comment on the steady state. I mean, my own read of it is that I think we are far from a steady state yet, unfortunately, because of COVID. And also, I think it's because there are lots of changes and amendments that are happening to the code every other year. Instance, like the big long delays that you're seeing is also happening not just because of understaffing, but the procedure to admit cases has been very, very long. And the Parliamentary Standing Committee report actually recommended that this process get digitized. So I think all of those could be pretty significant movers in, how this process is going to evolve. And as I mentioned, there isn't any code currently on sort of group insolvency, which is a big part, right? I mean, there's so many big business houses in India, and how that evolves is going to be seen. There's nothing in the legislation really right now. Everything is ad hoc. So also on cross-border insolvency, right? A lot of these guys have assets, outside India. So definitely, I think it was a huge landmark reform. It's already having some impact. Has it reached a steady state? My own read would be, no, I think we're a little bit away from it for now.
More questions. Professor Panagarya.
If I may just, on this COVID issue, Nandini, because geographically the impact of COVID was sort of spread out, meaning, there were times when Maharashtra was hit with it. Then there were times when West Bengal got hit. Timings were different. So I just wonder if there is a way to kind of exploit that variation to see. Again, probably not enough to do regressions and all, but you may see in the raw data at least some impact from COVID through this differences in the timing of the various waves that came in different geographical areas. I mean, the COVID data are available at very granular level. You can get it at the district level and below. So that might be a way to sort of, get some idea of how the proceedings are kind of moving in areas impacted at a given time by COVID and those that are not impacted by COVID.
There are a couple of more questions, Nandini, for you on the chat. One is, I don't know if it's doable, but I think the suggestion is one way to enhance the value of this paper to compare the impact in the first 5 years of an insolvency law introduced in few other countries and whether the results for India. I mean, if there are papers, you could just compare some of the effects, with some of the other. And second is one aspect the IBC doesn't address yet is cross-border resolutions. So I don't know if you have something to say about that. One additional thing from me. If, again, looking at your slide 7, what is going on with withdrawn cases? I was wondering, it's a large number of withdrawn cases. Are they really withdrawn or something else going on?
So Yeah, the cross-border resolutions is something that I believe they're working on, and this is, I mean, it's not yet in place from what I know. Yeah, I think comparisons are always useful. So thank you for those. Thank you for those suggestions. So far as the withdrawn cases go, so these are essentially once the company is admitted into the CIRP process, if the creditor and the company come to some agreement, and then they can, basically petition the court, and the court can agree that they withdraw. So in which case they have worked out a payment system. And so I think that the reason I highlighted that is because I think that suggests an effect of the creditor in possession, process. So because once they appoint an insolvency professional, then the company's management loses control. So those other guys are put in place. So basically, when a creditor files, this might create an incentive for those who are basically just not paying their money, paying off their debts, even if they could, to say, okay, now we will. And again, this is suggestive, so we haven't specifically looked at that, but it suggests like a direct effect of the creditor in possession laws, which also might have an indirect effect, as Meghna was talking about.
Thank you very much, Nandini and Meghna. Professor Panagare, if it's okay, we can close this session if there aren't any further comments from anyone, which I don't see.
Well, thank you both very much, actually, Nandini, especially to you, because when I first approached you to write the paper, I thought, we'll just get some tables and so forth, but you really pushed it very far in a relatively short period of time. So I think credit to you and credit to Khushbu for having really done a wonderful job. And you really opened many new doors. I think, there's the type of policy work that we really need to happen. As the laws and the rules and regulations change. So fantastic, really. I mean, that's the sort of mission we see at Raj Center for us. So thanks. And thanks, Meghna. Your comments were absolutely fantastic. Really, you put things in full perspective. So thanks again. Hope we can continue this as we proceed further in the next year. So thanks again. Surjit is here. So I think we can start. We go to the next session. And let us see if we can get good. I was about to send NK a message, but we have him here. Surjit will introduce NK, whichever way he wishes to, but I just want to say just a couple of lines on Surjit. So it is really fantastic to have you here, Surjit. And let me just say that Surjit is somebody I've known for the longest time. He was 2 years senior to me, or maybe 3 years senior to me at Princeton. And when I arrived, he was quite a legend on the Princeton campus among students and others. And then, of course, he has such a friendly personality. So he then went on to do a lot of bigger, better things, and spent several years in the US, working both in the World Bank, private sector, Brookings institution. He has been everywhere. And then he decided to return to India, became an investor. And of course, his love seems to be to write. And the other love is cricket, as far as I kind of recall. You have even written a book on cricket, right? So it's really fantastic to have you, Surjit. Thanks very much. Currently, of course, you are the Executive Director of India at the International Monetary Fund. I must say, a very unconventional Executive Director who continues to write in the media with as much gusto as you did before you became the Executive Director. So it's quite unusual. Pleasure to have you. And over to you.
Yeah. Thank you, Arvind, and thank you for the nice, warm introduction. And, as you said, we've known each other now 50 years, and counting. And it is a real honor and privilege to have this conversation with NK. And, I don't know how to introduce him, whether for this subject, which is on the fiscal conundrum. He's been a leading authority, policy maker, thinker on the Indian economy we used to follow him when we were in graduate school or soon after that. And, I've had the privilege of knowing him very well in India. He's also been in the kind of policy-making formal role. There was a nice stint at the PMO with PM Bajpai. And, his record on policy-making, fiscal, he's got this award from Japan, Legion. So he's been a very warm personality dominating the Indian policy scene for now much longer than you and I have been working on it. So NK, really honor, and as you know, this is the chapter on which we'll discuss is close to your heart, has been close to my heart. You've just done a lot more practice with it and policy with it. So I'll, do this conversation as we'll go through your chapter and then to the larger implications for fiscal policy in India and elsewhere. We can't lose this opportunity to, as well as fiscal policy during the pandemic. But let me start with your chapter on the fiscal conundrum. And, it has fiscal policy in India, which you have been very, very, actually, I should mention back in 97, when I first got to know NK personally, was when he was the architect of the dream budget. And in terms, and I know he was very worried about whether the tax cut would lead to a declining in tax revenues. We had extensive discussions on that. My usual DNA plus optimistic self said there won't be any problems, and there weren't any. But let NK guide us through the various pitfalls and many more achievements on the fiscal side that India has achieved over the last 30, 40 years.
Well, first of all, let me say how overwhelmed I am by these warm words, Sujit, which you have spoken about me. Our own relations go back a very long time. I do not want today's conversation to be one of a close group of mutual admiration set of groups, which includes, by the way, Arvind, for whom he knows that I have this long, endearing affection over many, many years. And it is with nostalgia that I look back on my relationship with him, many others engaged in Colombia, particularly with Professor Jagdish Bhagwati and with Padma. And of course, with you, Sujit, now a very dominant shaper of Indian policy. As Arvind very rightly put it in his pithy introduction to you, that a rare executive director who has never allowed his independent thinking to be alloyed in any way by the mildews of the fund and the other is the fiscal conundrum. I was trying to think that why do people use the word fiscal conundrum? And I think this is because of the inherent enigma, or if I may say so, the dichotomy between the politics of fiscal policy and the economics of fiscal policy. And the asymmetry is what could be loosely, therefore, become a conundrum, which requires constant recalibration and the need to apply fresh approaches on the subject. Let me also say that little bit going back on the past experience, and since Sujit, I was privileged to be introduced by you as someone engaged in India's policy making, or a watcher, or in some ways a neutral person over a very long period of time. I would say a couple of propositions. One obvious proposition is that for a very, very long time in the Indian literature, the word fiscal never came into official parlance. The word was budget deficit. We lived with budget deficits, and this following without realizing that it was the absence of a fiscal policy and proximate years of fiscal profligacy, which was the most important proximate reason for successive rounds of India's balance payments crisis, for which we had to resort to exceptional borrowing from our donors, from International Monetary Fund, and from other entities. So I think that we lived through all this. And what amazes me is, if I look back, is even after the 1991 crisis, we never realized, Sujit, that issues of fiscal policy, which in some ways are really the most important factor leading to overall macroeconomic stability and what may be called responsible growth. It took a Vajpayee government, to which you alluded to have the first fiscal law, the first FRBM Act. And therefore, to a historian like you, if you look back, why did it take an NDA prime minister like Mr. Vajpayee, not himself a great economist, to really realize India has had greater economists in more vantage positions? Why did it take someone like Vajpayee to really, at his period, encourage the enactment of the first fiscal law? That brought about a lot of calibration in the kind of fiscal policy which existed till then. We continued very happily till with the change of government, a pause button was put on the entire approach of fiscal policy in 2007. Alas, I say this alas, because that was also a year when the revenue buoyancy could have really given you the opportunity for retiring public debt and creating greater space for more responsible capital spending. And we continued with that with the global financial crisis. And it took, in some strange way, another NDA government. And I'm not trying to put the NDA, UPA, please forgive me if I give that impression. But it really took someone like Mr. Arun Jaitley, under the leadership of Prime Minister Modi, to enact a calibration of the first FRBM Act when it was in the 2018 budget, based on the recommendations of a committee which I had the privilege to head, which therefore made changes in the 2003, making moving over from the first generation of fiscal rules to the second generation of fiscal rules, namely multiple rules instead of single rule, instead of just fiscal deficit target, to have debt as an important principal target, with two or three important aspects. First and foremost, the fact that if you want to really have overall macroeconomic stability, the one thing that people look at is the overall debt. Debt not of the central government, but the debt of the general government, which included the states. So the first focus on the states, and I will comment a little more on some of these, which really brought back, and therefore it struck me that it took a leadership under the present Prime Minister, who, in spite of successive provocations, whether it be the pandemic, whether it be, for instance, the pressures of the slowdown of the economy, not to deviate in too much of a violent way to the overall macroeconomic framework, which had given India long-term stability and growth. As I look forward, I will just make 4 comments. Where are we now? We are now in the second generation fiscal rules. These are fairly robust set of rules. These fiscal rules have a degree of inbuilt flexibility because automatic stabilizers in this are contained in the escape clauses, which defines the circumstances in which you can deviate from the overall fiscal norms with the condition that you return back to it. So in that sense, it is the improvement on a regime of just a fixed fiscal pointer, which was really the earlier regime. The second important area is that the states have become more directly in the picture by having enacted their own state-level Fiscal Responsibility Act based on the recommendations of the 11th Finance Commission. And the third is that given other pressures, we must recognize that this government has taken the audacious step in the previous two budgets to bring about much greater transparency and credibility in terms of fiscal data, but for the first time reckoning all off-budget and contingent liabilities as part of the overall matrix of calculation. What is the path forward? And that's my last point, and I will stop when we begin the conversation. I think we need to do four more things. First, we need to give some thought on in what manner the symmetry between an independent monetary policy and the fiscal policy can become even much more congruous, and whether independent fiscal institutions, which are not binding on government, but which would be exceedingly helpful as a pointer, is an area which I think that requires much greater attention. The second important issue, on which we want to give some thought, how, and this is something that Sujit, you are a great believer in allowing market economics to work for itself. In what manner is the fact that those parts, subnational governments, which manage their finances responsibly, are recognized and rewarded by the market as compared to those who follow policy of profligacy. And therefore, the issue of the implicit sovereign guarantee to all subnational government debt, how does one revisit the issue of this important factor, which will then enable the market to therefore reward states who manage their finances more responsibly as compared to the other? And will this therefore propel us in the direction of thinking about in what manner you can even have sub-national bankruptcy without the rating of the sovereign at the central government being in any way impaired? I do not want to go into specific examples, but I do want to certainly, Sujit, with your permission, say this, that the last 3 months have been a somewhat exhausting experience for me to watch this election cycle and to come to the conclusion that the competition which exists in giving away more and more free and economics based on totally destructive populism, what is the end game if there are no consequences and punishments for aberrant fiscal behavior? And therefore, sometimes I wonder whether, frankly, subnational bankruptcy is something which would not be really something to which we need to give greater thought. Final thought. I think that, Sujit, you were so generous in mentioning some of the important policy places where I have worked in. But one area, which was a big learning experience for me, Sujit, was my 6 years in Parliament. And the reason why I mentioned this is that the parliamentary illiteracy, and I use that very, very consciously, on fiscal policies is something which has to be seen to be believed. The fact that how to get the legislatures in state governments, how to get parliamentarians more educated on the central role of responsible fiscal behavior, which is an important contributor to India's macroeconomic stability and which will propel economic growth. And I say this with some degree of remorse because I could succeed in my entire 6 years, notwithstanding my repeated efforts, I could not succeed one day where I could focus the attention of the upper house in Parliament to the importance of fiscal and fiscal related policies. And therefore, it has been a gnawing thought in my mind of when can we really get state legislatures, MLAs, MLCs, MPs, both the Lok Sabha and the Rajya Sabha, engaged in realizing the importance of responsible fiscal behavior. And when we do succeed in that, I think this conundrum will end, because that will be the final bridging of the asymmetry between sensible politics with sensible economics, which is what makes issues of fiscal policy an ever-challenging one. I stop here, Sujit, and thanks for this opportunity.
Thank you, NK, especially for your last four. It will take us several hours to discuss it, but I think you may have been disappointed in your tenure as an MP, but you well laid the foundations, the road where we are headed and where we will reach that destination, where upper house, lower house, thinking about economics per se, economic policy per se, including fiscal policy, will be I dare say, the dominant feature, as it is in most other, certainly in advanced countries. So no disappointment for you there. We had to travel that road, and you, of course, did exceptionally well in that traveling. But I want to, and as part of that road, as part of that experience, as part of being a major policymaker on economic policies, whether in government or outside of government, you must now be coming to the conclusion that the fiscal conundrum may not be a conundrum anymore, which I think you hinted at. If you look at the data, and I'll come to the GST data, which just got announced, 1.4 trillion in a month. But, you look at tax data, compliance data, personal income taxes, corporate income taxes, as well as indirect taxes, as well as expenditure constraints or restraint, not constraints. I mean, this is the end of the road, no more conundrum. And especially when you look at other countries. So let me, which I'll come to after your comments on this.
No, I think that, Sujit, thank you for raising this. I think that I should really have raised it myself, because at the end of it, if you all believe that it is R minus G, and we must focus on the G component, which is the growth, and the contributory factors which will bridge this, the behavior both on the revenue and the expenditure side, is a centerpiece in all this discussion. And I must say that on revenues, those people who were somewhat cynical, if you remember, when the GST was first introduced, felt that it was really nothing but a punishment which was being inflicted on all stakeholders, which was only enlarging the area of unhappiness, and brought about, would be severely jolted when they realized that if you have patience, if you pursue policies which are sensible, the GST will begin to serve the intended purpose which it had. Long ago, if you remember, Sujit, since you have been a keen follower, the idea of a GST was embedded long ago, when it took exactly 17 years. It took this leadership to really enact it in 2017. And there have been teething troubles. But I think that the progress which we have made on the compliance factor alone in GST is beginning to have great multiplier effects. And I think if they do 2 more things or 3 more things, which we have mentioned in successive recommendations, which are recognized by the Prime Minister and the Finance Minister and the officials. 1, broadbanding of rates, having perhaps in GST 3 rates, getting rid totally of inverted duty structures fully, improving the technology platform, and of getting rid of exemptions and of making a truly general integrated GST. We do not know what great benefits it would have in terms of improving the quality of compliance, making it genuinely a simple tax, and having great benefits from it from the viewpoint of really bringing about revenue gains, which would enable much greater space, fiscal space, for enhanced public outlays on some of the things which are favorites of yours and mine, enhancing capital expenditure, particularly on the efficiency and the reliability of infrastructure. Similarly, I think that when the audacious step was taken, if I may say so, I happened to be, by sheer accident, Sujit, with the finance minister on the day in Goa, on the day she was to address the GST Council. And that was the day she had just announced this deep cut on the corporate rate tax, aligning it to the best global practices on corporate rates. And then, of course, came a lag in which there was a lot of critical references that this was only a giveaway to the corporate sector, government revenues are going to suffer, little recognizing that far-reaching reforms of this kind do need leads and lags to bring about. So coupled with the reform of the corporate tax, on the expenditure side, similarly, for instance, follow through on the recommendations of the Finance Commission on much deeper rationalization of the centrally sponsored schemes and of targeting expenditure on capital expenditure instead of on revenue expenditure, realizing the multiplier effects of such capital expenditure. I think that these, when pursued, do not only constitute deep economic reforms, these, in fact, will really end the conundrum about which we talked about, which will also end the conundrum because people will increasingly realize that sensible politics and sensible economics are really flip sides of the same coin.
Well, talking about sensible policy and sensible economics, I can't lose this opportunity to ask you. We've had the tragic and universal and worldwide experience of the pandemic, which forced governments to rethink, at least for the short term, policy making, especially on the fiscal side, and especially on how do you take care of the poor who are most affected by the pandemic. Now, where do you see, and if one looks at the record as of now, we haven't had that big a jump in the inflation rate, and the food policy and other interventions by the government have not had that much of an impact on the fiscal side and delivered the benefits. So I know that's a long, but I want you to comment on the comparative, because, you much longer than me, but, we've always grown up and studied as to how other countries are doing better than us, and we've recognized it. You think the time has come for the world, media included, to recognize the very forefront, enlightened policy making that the Indian government has shown through the pandemic?
I would think so, Sujit. Sooner than later, let me add, that there is a greater recognition of the fact that this was a calibrated, well thought out policy for 4 reasons, if I may contribute. First, I think that if you look at the overall package, the leadership recognized that people who were affected by the pandemic required immediate relief. And that was in terms of enhancing the vaccine strategy, the penetration of the vaccine, bearing all the costs of the vaccine, enhancing the public distribution system, giving a vastly greater amount of resources to the Manrega, which provided direct employment, particularly to migrant workers who had gone. Couple some of these measures, with what was done directly in terms of the direct benefit transfers on the Jan Dhan account, and numerous other ways in which benefits were directly transferred to people who were affected and bear the cost entirely. Strategy 1. Strategy 2, the great belief of the leadership. Never allow a crisis to become a wasted opportunity. And the far-reaching economic reform package contained in the 5 pronouncements of the finance minister directly at the time of the package was something breathtaking, recognizing that given leads and lags, it will have a multiplier effect on a much faster rebound and recovery. Third, recognizing that the policy must be an integrated one. Rarely have central bankers worked in such close cooperation and symmetry than it has been the Indian case. That a lot of the burden was very legitimately, appropriately taken by the central bank in terms of extending the moratorium, giving the benefits of guarantees, giving other comforts to the bank to minimize the pain of the corporate and other sector which had liabilities with the banking system. So with all this, the direct fiscal cost to the government, when all this was taken together, was something which was not terribly shocking to upset the entire equilibrium of responsible fiscal policy. The world in general felt, oh, it was far too little. What was she holding back for? She was also holding back for another reason, Sujit, and you and I know this, that it was when all this was being done, the end of pandemic was nowhere in sight. Is it a sensible policy for the war general to exhaust the last ammunition without realizing what the enemy's next step might be? So holding back and behaving responsibly and yet addressing the situation has resulted in multiplier gains. And therefore, I think it is time that the sagacity of the well-calibrated action receives much greater recognition than it has been so far possible by economists, particularly many very leading economists, if I may say so, recognizing the overall sagacity and enlightened leadership under which this package of policies went for.
And unfortunately, I might add, by leading thinkers. So I hope with your influence that might change. You know, I don't want to, you brought this up as one of the 4 things, or maybe it was a side integrated comment, but I think very important for us to discuss and for you to tell us a little bit more on what you hinted at, the future of federalism and, if you will, simultaneous elections in India. You alluded to the fact of populism every 3 months. This was one of your disappointments. This one of, I'll confess very honestly, it is one of my big hopes that we will see one-time elections in India sooner than later. But just to, expand, I think we are, thanks to the economic policy, the progress we've made, etc. So just give your thoughts on what's the likelihood of that happening in let's say, in the next 5 years?
Well, you touch on a subject which worries me greatly. And I say this, that if you look at it, Indian governments are elected for 5 years at a time, all things being equal. The government comes to office for a term of 5 years under the present electoral laws. Immediately after, more or less around the second year, the cycle of sub-national elections begin. And that begins to have its first impact. Parliament sessions get abridged. The legislatures and parliamentarians are defocused. one after the other. We have just gone through 5 important elections, Sujit. And since the time that they were announced, and now the focus of governance has been, let us say, it is to the tribute that during it is this time, which also had all the geopolitical emerging crises. It's a time also managing the pandemic. So it was really quite a challenge to the leadership to do this balancing act. But the fact remains that the overall governance process was distracted with 5 important elections. Hardly have we got out of that, that this year there are elections going to take place in 2 important states, and next year 2-3 more important states, and then you begin to hit the last inning. So this constant electoral cycle and destructive competitive economics and politics followed in the electoral rhetoric, which governments then are enjoyed to fulfill. I mean, take, for instance, the issue of the rhetoric in Punjab. Now, both of us, you and I, are familiar with the finances of Punjab. The finances of Punjab are in a perilous state. Lot of promises were made during the electoral campaign, but those promises now had to be fulfilled by the party which has come to power and had made those promises. But where are the resources? Similarly, other example. So what I mean to say that unless really speaking, you have a greater synchronization and convergence of this repetitive cycle, in effect, 5-year governance is being reduced to 2 years of governance window, which was not the intention of the founders of our constitution, which was not cannot be the intention of any of the electoral laws. And therefore, it is my quest that can we see a greater convergence to bring about really policies which enables governments when elected to sensibly govern for 5 years, or at least for about 4.5 years before they get distracted in the next cycle of elections. Whether it will happen or not, I think that, Sujit, some important pieces of your research and writing will encourage a wider debate. The Times of India opened one set of wider debate on a face-off, where some people wrote very responsibly. But going beyond that, I think that we must write about it. We must encourage more thinking to really realize the important gains for the nation as a whole if there was a greater synchronization in the electoral cycle.
No, thank you. This is, as they say, aapke muh mein gud shakkar, tons of it. And I remain, quite optimistic that something structural will happen over the next 5 years. So we'll celebrate that when it happens. I'm not saying if it happens, when it happens. Arvind, I don't know if you want to leave a few minutes for others to ask questions of NK, but I have one, pet subject of mine, which I've often discussed with NK. So after that, you can. And this has to do with, the fiscal conundrum, back to where we started and knowing the place for the first time. Fiscal deficits, long been believed. It's a related question, that fiscal deficits cause inflation. Therefore, you need to control fiscal deficits, number one. Number two, and we're seeing this playing across the world, and you as a very, very prominent policymaker on this have dealt with this for now 40 years or so, that food inflation as well as oil inflation, non-core inflation is now rampant in many parts of the world. And this issue has come up all the time. If anybody has got real experience with both policy making and food price inflation affecting the headline inflation, non-core inflation, and therefore headline, it's you. We now see major thinkers around the world saying big supply shock everybody recognizes the supply shock, and let's control it by raising interest rates. So I'm not saying that the shock is not there, but just your thoughts on whether, independent of other considerations, whether a supply shock inflation deserves a strict monetary response?
In my view, personally, perhaps not. You may or may not share this view, but I think that what is more important is to continue with the measures which you have undertaken, which will really encourage supply-side responses to manage the emerging any inflationary pressures than a knee-jerk reaction. Because I do not think that the examples of some of the other countries was really applicable to India, because exactly if you go to the earlier part of our discussion, during the pandemic and even during the earlier period, the degree of fiscal expansion which was undertaken there was breathtaking as compared to the modest expansion which may have taken place in India. So I think that our responses must be really calibrated to correct what we did. And each country must calibrate it to what they have done in terms of the degree. So I would really say that we should really take a balanced, calibrated view. And I'm happy to be able to say that I suspect that the powers that be, the Monetary Policy Committee in India on interest rates, which has taken an independent view, is quite conscious of this aspect, that any correction should not be knee-jerk reactions, but must be really in proportion to the kind of changes which are really necessary.
And that's a result, I might add, of the road well taken and well traveled and well experienced. We have learned from experience, and I share with you the optimism. It won't happen here. Unfortunately, I do see it happening elsewhere in the world. And this is perhaps another, and I've been trying to push the Indian experience to make people aware that this may not be the exact policy. So, we could go on. I'll ask Arvind, I'll be happy to go on this discussion. Last point, or the comment actually, NK, you and I, and it comes out very nicely in this conversation, the passion for both politics and economics and the integration of the two in policy making, I think has been a hallmark of your thinking, your writing, and your policy recommendations for a long, long time. And it is a passion that I share in equal measure. So thank you very much for this enlightened conversation. I hope Arvind enjoyed it, and I hope the rest of the people enjoyed it. Over to you, Arvind.
Absolutely fantastic, Sujit. Absolute terrific, NK. So what we can do is, even I would like to chat a little bit more. So anybody maybe will regard as the formal part of this as having been concluded. But anybody who wants to hang around and stay, please stay. We had contracted your time till 12, our time and 6:30 or 9:30 IST. But if Sujit and NK are willing to stay another few minutes, is that okay?
Fine.
NK? Yep.
Fine.
Okay. So others may have questions as well, but I'll ask one or two. One, this issue of subnational kind of bankruptcy that Sujit, of course, has written on this before, perhaps from the days of times when New York City was once on the brink of bankruptcy many years or decades ago. I have some vague recollection, but enticing. But I think what really worries me in that context about the subnational ones is the kinds of profligacy that is done that actually doesn't necessarily impact the government that is taking the charge, but it impacts a government in the future. Now, as you know, well, you have a Rajasthan connection in K, and I come from Rajasthan. And the chief minister presenting his budget this year apparently did away with the pension reform that had been done. It was a very difficult reform to do, and the implications were absolutely, very far-reaching in terms of, what that reform did actually for the future finances. Now, the state chief minister has withdrawn that and says, well, we are going to go back to the old pension system. And I just don't see it. Now, of course, the reforms began with 2004, so it applies to employees who started working in 2004. And thinking 30 years is what it takes before you retire, the first batch of people who would be impacted by this now return to the old would be 30 years from 2004, so 2034 or 35. It impacts way into the future. But when it impacts, how is that government at that time is going to get the money? Is there a solution to this sort of problem?
It's a very difficult question, Arvind. Let me come back to something you started this, that Sujit has written about this issue of subnational bankruptcies and whether it is at all possible or not possible. Now, it's like this, that those of us who have studied the Constitution recognize that as far as the states are concerned, they are only governed under Article 293 of the Constitution. So all that the central governments only handle on them is that as long as they owe any money in any form or the other to the central government, the concurrence of the central government is necessary for enabling them for any borrowing. Now, based on the state FRBM, we equate in 3% fiscal deficit for each state on an annual basis, in line with what the central government has upon itself. Apart from 293.3, Arvind, there is no other constitutional provision except that if a state goes completely bust, the central government has an option of declaring a financial emergency and take over the finances of the state. But this is an extreme measure, and this is not something which is a sustainable way. That is why I had suggested, in making of the observation, that one of the points that I had made, what is the way and modalities in which the market sentiment is made available to state governments on the way in which they are managing their finances? Would, for instance, the next time that the Rajasthan government, looking at its more tenuous debt position, and certainly the case of Punjab, its more tenuous position, will market penalize them for irresponsible behavior and price their market development loans in a manner which reflects that higher risk premium which they have? This will not happen till such time as you have an implicit guarantee to all market borrowings in one form or the other. So this is the real catch, that can one look to really devices like 293.3? Now, if you look at the debates, Arvind, in the Constituent Assembly, particularly the exchange of views between Ambedkar and K.T. Shah and others, when this issue of state borrowings had come up, the broad response was there was a touching belief in the responsible behavior of state governments, which is embedded as part of the Constitution. None of them visualized. For instance, one of them, if I may say, K.T. Shah remarked in response to Ambedkar in that debate to say, I cannot think and imagine that any state government would want to mortgage its forests, its mines, its water resources to be able to contract borrowing. it is unthinkable. So the abiding faith was in their responsible behavior is at the heart of the debate in the Constituent Assembly. That is why the provisions in some of this are limited. But your question must be addressed. Is there any recourse that some government's irresponsible behavior leaves behind a trail of debt and legacy to its successor government, which makes it impossible for them to undertake a responsible development strategy? And what are the options that the Constitution provides? I have no answer. Should it be that you need to have an entity? Sometimes I have thought that if, for instance, Arvind, if the Finance Commission, like the model of South Africa and Australia, was an annual grants commission, not a 5-year commission, and if each year the devolution was determined on the basis of some responsible conduct and behavior, then you have a mechanism for perhaps trying to really align the state government's policy with what would be rational and sensible. But that recourse doesn't exist. The Finance Commission gives its awards of 5 years, has given the awards, which not only means a devolution for the states, but it means a revenue deficit grants, which, by the way, in the case of Rajasthan, since you raised that, I gave a generous revenue deficit grant in the belief that the power sector, which is the big elephant in the Rajasthan finances, would be repaired in a manner for which they had presented a paper. But now an announcement of this kind on pension undoes all that. So I do not know. I can only share with you some of the options, but we need to carry this debate forward in finding mechanisms within our constitution or to create some which will enable more responsible behavior by state subnational governments.
Yeah. It seems to me you need some sort of constitutional amendment which ties the hands of the governments in a way that they cannot do things which are going to then fiscally bankrupt a future government.
That's right.
Something of that sort is what you would require. Something
by
like
the way,
that.
when finance commissions give their revenue deficit grants, which are really tied, must be tied to some responsible behavior, as indeed this time we have done for the local bodies. Each of the releases are based on some responsible way. We need to find some way in which the resources which they receive they're obliged to do it in a responsible way.
Right. Okay, there are a couple of questions that have come here, if I may,
Yeah.
So there is one from our common friend Shailendra. So he's asking, what road ahead, and this is to NK specifically, what road ahead would you like to recommend for the fiscally sensitive civil society on issue of enhancing fiscal literacy among our legislators at the national and subnational level?
Yeah.
So I think
before you answer that, NK, nobody is wanting to lose a captive NK. There's another question, very nice. And then I see Prachi and Karthik with raised hands. So court, I'm very happy to stay as long. So, but just to let you know that there's excess demand, and let's hope all of it gets fulfilled. NK.
So, Arvind, from our common friend Shailendra. Shailendra,
yes.
This is a direct reply to you. I think you are doing an absolutely outstanding job in the organization to which you have given leadership on tax online compliances, which bring together each year in multiple ways issues of how to improve tax policies, improve tax buoyancies, carry forward tax reforms, improve the experience of the SSCs. The same organization, why don't you think, Shailendra, of organizing some interactions involving parliamentarians, 1 or 2 in Delhi and 1 or 2 in some important state capitals. You can do so, 1 for East India, 1 for the West India, I think to every question, I must throw it back at you. Shailendra, you can play an important role. You're doing so on tax issues. Why don't you do so also on fiscal issues? It will make a difference.
Okay, so there is another one, which this is from Nilesh Hanswadkar. So he asks, in your estimate, what is the time horizon in which India will reach a fiscal surplus situation, given your deep domain understanding of the drivers of this metric?
So I do not know whether what you mean. Thank you for the that question. I do not know what you mean by way of fiscal surplus. Do you mean primary surplus? And do you mean really of the general government or of central government and so on? All that, of course, depends on the most important factor, which I mentioned. G, growth. What are those factors which will really catapult our growth rates to what our potential is? And we are nowhere near our potential right now. If you are able to achieve that potential, I think that the fiscal management and the strategy for fiscal management would become that much simpler. What is the time frame? Well, it depends on the kind of policies which are pursued. But I do believe that the government has embarked, and I'm happy to be able to say this, on a really, really ambitious reform agenda. One important aspect of that agenda is a mindset change. It is easy to pursue a policy. It is more difficult to have a mindset change. This government represents that mindset change. We followed a baggage in which we believed only in public outlays. We had scant faith in private capital. We remained deeply suspicious. For the first time, by an ambitious program of genuine privatization of important public assets, including, hopefully, if the bank experiment gets enlarged and is really deepened in multiple ways, these, when carried forward, does represent an important mindset change in which private capital, innovation, and technology will play an increasingly important role. I say technology because we are well positioned on extending the gains of technology in multiple facets of our economic activity, from agriculture to better management of renewable energy, to education, to health policies. And when that is combined with the important sectoral reforms, along with the broader reforms, I see that India's growth potential will be realized sooner than any of the critics would like to believe.
So there is one more here, which I will read out, and then we come to Prachi and Karthik. So this may be a comment, 10K, but you decide. I'll just read it out. This was relating to the fiscal deficits of the states. So this says, the other end of the worry is that if we decouple the state's creditworthiness from Government of India's, then at some point this may be used as a tool of retribution by the center to starve a state of financial support that they may legitimately deserve.
Well, very frankly, I think that if there is any imputation or a suggestion that this ability should be done for non-economic reasons, but for purposes of penalizing state governments, which have ideologically a different hue than the government in office in the central government, that is not a road which any sensible person would suggest. However, we must look and explore opportunities in which the voice of the market gets increasingly felt, appreciated, and acted upon by state governments. That is why one instrument is how does the market reward states which manage their finances responsibly as compared to those which believe in fiscal profligacy. And there are modalities in which within our constitutional framework can really bring about that kind of a change, that would be a more important, credible, and long-lasting. The issue of subnational bankruptcy, which I alluded to and on which Sujit has written, is a kind of an extreme solution because the Constitution has other modalities. When you reach that stage of subnational bankruptcy, for all practical purposes, the Constitution enjoins the right to declare a financial emergency in that state, which is tantamount to really the subnational bankruptcy. But the voice of the market being allowed to filter, go to the states with consequences thereafter would be a more reasonable, responsible step forward.
Okay. Prachi?
Thank you, Professor Panagaria. Sujit, Mr. Singh, this has been terrific conversation indeed. So I had two questions. One on a topic so very close to your heart and my heart, which is the FRBM. So do you think we need to rethink the framework? Because reducing debt from the current levels will not be easy and will not be costless. Yeah. So, what are the options and what are the trade-offs? So some thoughts on that. And second is seventh schedule. Do we need to rethink? And do you see any debate and activity around that? So let me stop there.
Prachi, you have asked questions which are not only dear to my heart, but I think on that we can have a whole engaging session. And who best to plead with than Arvind that maybe this is a subject, Arvind, sometime you could think of some other way in which we can have a full session on that. Let me give you very short answers because I do not want to really stretch the patience of those who have very kindly logged in. Do we need another FRBM? Since right now the matrix which we had given on the calibration of debt is way misaligned with what is the current debt to GDP, and that management of the debt stock, which no matter what fiscal policies you pursue, will take a much longer time looking at the stock of debt. What do you need? I have pleaded, Prachi, that instead of another FRBM Act, I have pleaded formally in the recommendations of the Finance Commission and argued in favor of a national debt policy, a well-articulated national debt policy, which engages and which encompasses the state governments as much as the central government. And let me say this, that this would be an appropriate way of at least thinking about it, because for the first time, we must give credit to the present finance minister that there was transparent accountancy. All off-budget and contingent liabilities were reckoned in the budget. This is something which had eluded successive governments. We at least now know that. And I think that all state governments must be encouraged to enact a new FRBM framework. They haven't really replicated the 2018 one. First that, and to adopt this exceedingly healthy lead, which has been given by the finance minister, of genuine data in terms of state-level parastatal entities, because there are many horrendous examples of that. And I think that all that can become part of a coherent national debt policy, which involves both the central and the state government. On the seventh schedule, I'm on record to say that the seventh schedule has as originally framed in list 1, 2, and 3 have outlived their utility. But not because of something that this government has done. It outlived its utility because the moment you really began to have 5-year plans, and Arvind had chaired the first distinguished chair, Niti Aayog was privileged to have someone of the eminence of Arvind to really stabilize that organization in the difficult transition of a planning commission period. But the fact remains that there is an inherent contradiction between recourse to Article 282 of the Constitution with the basic architecture or the 7th schedule of the Constitution. What does Article 282 of the Constitution allow you? which are supposed to be, by the way, a miscellaneous provision in the Constitution, allows the central or the state government to provide any resources for any project or any scheme which they consider useful for the overall developmental objectives. Under this, all centrally sponsored schemes cutting across mercilessly list 1, list 2, and list 3, obliterating that distinction, one undertaken without even the formality of the transfer of some of these to the concurrent list. So I do believe that given the fact that elections all over the world, elections in Delhi, elections in state capitals, the electoral psyche is determined by who is the leader who is going to lead. And that represents the electorate's consent. Looking at that, therefore, these distinctions of list 1, list 2, and list 3 must be revisited fundamentally to recognize the manner in which overall political matrix has changed all over the world. And we would be lagging behind the needs and compulsions of the time if we do not look at this subject as intensely as the issue deserves.
Karthik.
Yeah, no, in fact, I can keep it very quick because you asked exactly the question I wanted. So, because the pension stuff worried me so much. And so I just wanted to come back and ask 2 follow-up questions to that, right? I mean, one is, see, obviously, constitutional amendments are going to be difficult, but to the extent that the reason we care about the state FRBM is not about debt per se, as much as the extent to which the downstream interest payments tie your hands, is it an easier mechanism to look at kind of the committed expenditure that will be implied by an increase in the pensions by going back to this old pension scheme and kind of, using that and therefore immediately being able to penalize in some way with regard to the amount of debt? Because the issue is not debt. The issue is the committed expenditure, which the pension is an equivalent of a deferred commitment. It's like basically when you go to the old pension, you're saying I am paying part of my current employees with debt, which I'm going to pay back in the future, right? Through those pensions. So fiscally, it's exactly the same thing. So that's just a thought. And then I think the Finance Commission version of that question is that, is there a way, and this is such a deeply difficult question because there's this trade-off between autonomy of an elected government to make its choices versus kind of paying the consequences for these profligate decisions. And so maybe, NK, you're right that the only way to do this is to bring the market into this. But I'm more worried about, is there a little bit of moral hazard built into the way the Finance Commission looks at revenue deficits because of not accounting or passing judgment on these past decisions that have been made? So that's more of a structural question.
Yes, Karthik, I think they are important issues. They were moral hazard questions for me when I was deliberating in the Finance Commission. And there were moral hazard questions in this respect, that when coming to the entire area of Article 275 of the Constitution, which enables us the latitude to recommend any revenue deficit grants, in addition to direct devolution to the states, should we or could we have factored and told, for instance, the state government, that I'm sorry, this expenditure which you incurred by way of additional interest on for the borrowing which you contracted due to this foolish decision is something which is inadmissible, and I'm not going to recognize that expenditure, and therefore I'm not going to take any note of that. And in the expenditure revenue calculation matrix, I knock it off from any calculation for any grant under Article 275 on which we have discretion. Would that have been perhaps morally more appropriate step? Let me give you an example of why, Karthik, you have raised a very important issue. And since I take it, Arvind, that we follow Chatham House rules in some manner or the other.
On that, I'm not sure. MK, this is open forum. There is audience.
Okay. No,
but we're no longer recorded.
But,
so I think the recording has stopped.
No. But I don't mind saying, because this is on record. So I mean, I'm not saying something very outrageous. But I do want to say that when I was in the state of West Bengal, or we were in the state of West Bengal, the redoubtable Chief Minister of West Bengal, who I had known for a very long time, and I think that we have a great deal of affection for each other. She told the Finance Commission unhesitatingly that, look here, I am in this financial mess because the left, which ruled for so many years, undertook such fiscally responsible decisions. Should the people of West Bengal pay for the sins of what happened by irresponsible decisions of the left government? And should you not, in some manner, while calibrating your revenue deficit grants, recognize the legacy debt, as she called it, the word which I adopted, legacy debt issue. So you are, Karthik, raising the issue of legacy debt. Mm-hmm. Some manner, we sought to address it, recognizing to some extent the fact that it is true that years of the left government had taken. But now take another case, Karthik. And these are two important cases, because I have given significant revenue deficit grants and in good faith. The issue of Punjab. The issue of Punjab loomed large in they made their presentation. Amarinder made the presentation that Akalis, who are really were partners of the NDA and are partners of the NDA, at that time the farm law thing had not taken place. They took some very responsible decisions on the management of the food economics of Punjab, which had resulted in an unsustainable debt situation. We also have the problem of drugs. We are a border state, which is the frontline state which has faced all wars and ravages right from the inception. Should you not in some way recognize the special characteristics of Punjab and free us from the burden of the terrible decision whose predecessor government had undertaken? Where, Karthik, your intervention is something which is food for thought, is suppose, which we did, give revenue deficit grants both to Punjab and to West Bengal and to some other, quite a few states. They were all in good faith. Who comes back to hold them accountable that this is breach of faith? And what are the modalities in which such an accountability process within the framework of parliamentary elections and elected governments having the autonomy can be undertaken? Why don't you give some thought, Karthik? I think this is a worthwhile subject which will be very useful, not only to.
In fact, I'm going to say something about this in my nearly finished book, which will be out later this year. So I'll share that with you.
Good, Karthik. Good show.
Okay, so well, thank you both, Sujit and MK. You've been incredibly indulgent, and you have held the audience here. In spite of we being more than half an hour overtime, you hardly lost anybody who was here. So that's a testimony to how engaging you both have been. So thanks again, and we'll certainly try to think of some event where we can have this longer discussion on the kinds of questions that Prachi had raised. So with that, we conclude the proceedings today. Yeah, NK?
Thank you. Thank you, Arvind, for this great opportunity. Colombia, apart from you, has so many other attractions and so many nostalgic Kapoors. I remember that so many times you have called me for most engaging discussions and so on and so forth. So thank you once again for the great honor and this great opportunity and privilege which I have had in today's interaction. Thank you, Arvind. Thank you, Surjit, for your generous words, and thank you for all the engaging discussions which you fostered. Thanks.
Thank you. Thanks all. Thank you very much.
To all. Thank you.
Yes.
Yeah.
And let's see you tomorrow morning. We have another day.
Yeah.
So, fantastic.